Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jill Reese. I am the Oaks Ministry Director and the founder. And this is Nick Gibson. He's the lead pastor of High Point Church. He's also the co-founder of Oaks Ministry Collaborative, who is hosting this event today.
Great. I just want to welcome all of you to High Point. I know for a lot of you this isn't your church home. Everybody has a probably diverse set of reasons exactly for being here, whether you've been struggling with addiction, whether you're trying to help somebody, you've got people in your life doing that, whether you're trying to train as an advocate in Oaks, whether you serve in the mental health industry and service arena or whatever. There's a lot, or whether you're a pastor or doing ministry. And so it'll be real interesting because we're going to bring a lot of different assumptions into this room, I'm sure, and experiences. And so we're just going to do our best. Did you want to show that slide?
Yes.
Sorry, you're going to jump into something else first.
Yes. Great. Okay, I will jump into something else.
I'm glad you're here.
We definitely rehearsed this. Okay, so yes, I just want to let you know who Oaks Ministry Collaborative is. So we exist to equip local churches to be rehabilitative and resilient communities for people in the healing process. And so we do that in a number of ways. We try to engage people primarily with their healing process with God and other people. So that's our main goal, even if it's through Oaks or connecting you with someone else, that's our main goal. And then we have events, we have groups, we have peer support connections within churches, and then we also try to connect churches and community mental health resources together. And so that's some of what we're doing today. Two of our speakers are clinical counselors in the field, and then we have faith leaders. We have Nick speaking also. So that's our goal.
Great. One of the things we want to try to clarify as we try to do some of this kind of integrative stuff is that it's very easy for you to hear two things from two different speakers, let's say, and feel like they're in radical contradiction with one another and we're all going to get in a fist fight soon about this, when that's just not really how it's going to work, okay? You're probably going to hear two different sentences today that you can't figure out how those could possibly go together. And so our goal is to really stay in a creative state of mind instead of a combative one. I tend to have a pretty combative spirit sometimes, but like just be like, okay, let's just try to take in what we can take in, and then we're gonna try to work it out later. Like let's get ingredients. And part of the issue is that what we find in helping people in just like every dynamic of life is there are just some ways of looking at something that just really clicks for somebody, and it really helps them, and you're like, I had no idea why that just helped you. But they're just in their mindset, with their background experiences, what really helped them, it just helps them. And then you can say the same thing to another person and think, well, this really helped that other person, or they were worse off than this person is. You know, this is really gonna help them. It's just blank stares from that. Does that make sense? And so one of the things to recognize is that what that also means is that sometimes very therapeutic language really helps somebody. They're like, oh, I think I get that. My brain works like that too. And sometimes really spiritual, like metaphorical, story-based narrative language about meaning and purpose, and really, really helps people. Sometimes both of them really help people at different times and in different ways. And one of the things we need to recognize is that it also that people who are working in the therapeutic industry and vocation, they're often getting people at their worst when their lives are the most dysfunctional. On the spiritual side of things, we're trying to help people not get there at all. We're trying to do like the preparatory work so that people don't end up in the water. You know what I mean? And the people who are blowing whistles and keeping people out of the water, and the people who are jumping in and throwing out life jackets, often have a different perspective about things, and they'll say things quite differently. Okay, and so when you think about that, the way we'll talk about spiritual direction and pastoral guidance, sometimes may sound like we're getting at something very different than when a mental health professional is talking about some of the most chronic forms of addiction and how they affect people's lives and how we try to treat them. Does that make sense? So we want to really encourage you that part of the philosophy of Oaks is we think this all can come together. If we have enough humility and creativity, and if we try to trust each other a little bit, that everybody's trying to do well by the people we're trying to serve, we can actually have a non-combative relationship, even though we'll have lots of arguments. That's the goal, to have a collaborative relationship in the midst of candor and really working things and hammering things out together. Does that make sense? So as you listen to our mental health professionals, as you listen to me as a pastor, just try to keep that kind of mentality in mind. That as we work towards collaboration, there's going to be moments where it's going to seem like there's tension, and that's okay. Does that make sense? And all of us are really open to talking with you. If you're like, Nick, you said this, does that mean this? Or Kevin, you said this, does that mean that? Ask those questions, because oftentimes what you think what we say implies, we don't think it implies. Does that make sense? All right, so the goal of Oaks is to keep an open mind, have a lot of candor as you talk with each other. Well, what does that mean? What are we gonna do with this? And we want spirited conversations that are pursuing a deeper understanding, but they're not unproductively combative. Does that make sense? And that's our goal. So we're trying to hold that spirit as we pursue this together.
Yeah, so both psychology and the Christian gospel, there's room in both of those, and there's a baseline understanding that there is more going on underneath the surface than it looks like there is. And so one analogy we have for today is a geode. At the tables, at your lunch tables, there's some geodes for you to take if you want one. They're also on the back table, but on the outside it looks like a rock that's kind of like it's bumpy and brown and dirty. But on the inside, there's something inside when you break it open. And so we just really want to have a posture today about curiosity of what is inside, what is underneath the behavior you might be experiencing yourself, what is underneath the behaviors you might see in someone else that you love and support, and what's really in there. And that's our posture today. It's just a curiosity of let's see what there is. So just a few hospitality notes for you guys. So we invite you to be part of this conversation. Also, we don't want to just talk at you. So on the handouts on your chairs, there's some QR codes. One is for Q&A. So if you have any questions that come up for you as the speakers are presenting, as you're in conversation with people today, please feel free to fill out this form. It's really short. It's just, what's your question and is it for someone in particular? And we will be watching that throughout today. So if there's any urgent questions, you can ask them. We'll try to cover those today. And then if there's not, we will address those. We have a podcast we can follow up on. Or if it's more of like, I just really need some personal help with this or want to talk to someone one-on-one, we will also follow up with you that way as well. So feel free to utilize that. And then we have a prayer room open. It's going to be down the hallway you came and then to the left. And there's going to be volunteers in there for you between 10 and 2 today to pray with you if you want someone to pray with. Even if you've never prayed before, that's fine. They can facilitate that time for you. And if you want to just go in there to reflect and take a little break, that's fine too. So please utilize that space. And we have some extra resources written up at the back table. There's also some books and some ways to just engage with more resources at the back table. The schedule for today, we have 3 talks. It's all on the agenda on your handout. We've got 2 clinical counselors. We will introduce them as they're coming up. And then we've got Nick presenting. We have the testimony. We have some worship and music planned. So it's going to be a great day. We also have a break for lunch at 11:30. Some other locations to know about. There's bathrooms in this hallway outside all of these doors. And then there's also another ministry using this space at High Point today. And so they're going to be on that side of the building. It's our Revive ministry for children with disabilities. So it's all blocked off, so hopefully it's very clear. But just don't try to break through the barriers we have tried to set up on purpose. We will get started with our first speaker.
I have your notes so I can read it too. So there's bathrooms on this hallway. There's the family one, and then for men and women. And then on this hallway, there's another set. And I suspect that the ones on the far hallway are going to be reserved for Revive. Does that make sense? Okay, and then one of the books that we selected for you on the back table is a book called Addiction, Banquet in the Grave by Ed Welch. And the reason I didn't want to get 50 books, because one, that's not my expertise. But generally speaking, in the church right now, if you're not a fundamentalist church, you tend to be kind of swung on the therapeutic side of language in terms of addiction. And so that book by Ed Welch is from CCEF, which is on the more conservative, historical, biblical, classically Christian side of things. And he's a psychologist who teaches at a seminary. And so a lot of his personal work has been trying to integrate psychological knowledge and biblical, classical Christian faith in a very Christianly robust way. And so I really encourage you to consider that book, not because I think it's this big corrective to the therapeutic culture, but it's we tend to speak more natively in the language of therapy than in classical Christianity right now as the church. And so for me, it's not about what's true, it's about if the ball is rolling down the center and starts rolling up this way, which way do you have to push it to get it back to where it should be? And I think that biblical, historical, classic Christianity integrative perspective is what's needed. Let me say this, if you're not a Christian and you're from a secular mental health perspective, come here and you're well, that book isn't for me, I would encourage you that it is for you even more, actually, because you're probably in like a intellectual housing that is never gonna have you interact with this kind of thought at all. And listen, like I was reading from a secular atheistic psychologist who hates religion yesterday, preparing for this talk, because you have to read different people. And so if you have not, in your programs or your study, interacted with deep classical Christian faith and what resources it brings to questions like addiction, I think you all the more should read a book like that. Does that make sense? All right, let's dive in. Kevin Doss is our first speaker. I'm gonna read, he works at Anesis Therapy Center, and I'm just gonna read his bio from there, which is, I think, relatively descriptive of what he, hopefully how you describe yourself, Kevin, I hope. Kevin Doss is a clinical substance abuse counselor from Anesis Therapy Center. As a culturally competent human service professional, he has a passion for providing support to individuals, assisting them in connecting with their strengths, and introducing them to coping strategies in order that they can function independently. In his practice, he utilizes solution-focused therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy in conjunction with dialectical behavioral therapy. He specializes in case management and individual skill building for children, adolescents, and adults, and substance abuse counseling. A favorite quote of his is, "The mind is more powerful than the body, and it has the strength to influence any obstacle." He believes that motivating an individual to focus on the solution and resources instead of the problem creates an environment where individuals become excited about discovering hidden strengths and unrecognized internal solutions. Kevin, why don't you come and share with us?
I want to first thank Jill and her team for inviting me. Thank you guys for that warm introduction. I don't know, it was something I've never heard anyone read a bio of me, but and then the last part of it just touched me. I was like, man, this is. But I'm gonna get through this. But good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to spend with us on this cold Saturday morning. I'm a walker. I don't normally. This is new for me to hold the mic for speaking. I'm normally singing, so I'm normally we're doing a lot of. So I will be doing a lot of walking. I want to first start off by telling a personal story, if that's okay with you guys. Okay. So, when I first got into this field, my first job, what my client asked me, he says, hey, my first job was over at working with individuals with opiate addictions. So my first client asked me, says, hey, have you ever been addicted to opiates? Because I don't want anybody working with me that have just read a book, took a class, and took a test.
Amen. That's fair.
So I took a deep breath, and I said, you know, addiction works the same, and yes, I have been addicted to something. Yes, I have that hard thing that I've struggled with. And I think we all have a hard thing that we struggle with. Whether it's coffee, phones, and amongst other things. So I told a story and I said, this is what is it that you've been addicted to? So I said, you know, I have been told that sugar is the most addictive thing that a person can get involved with. And I have this thing, at the time, a friend of mine had asked me to help her daughter sell Girl Scout cookies. Now this is a true story, so don't judge my book. This is a judgment-free zone. So a friend of mine asked me to help her daughter sell Girl Scout cookies. So she says, well, how many do you think you can sell? I said, well, give me about 50 boxes. So I had the boxes in my car. How many of the boxes I actually sold to other individuals is very minimal. I probably ate up 75% of the boxes of Girl Scout cookies that were in my car, so I had to pay for 75% of the boxes. So I said, I said, that's a hard thing for me. I said, and when I start to eat one, I grab a box, I start to say, okay, I'm gonna just snack on this, and before I know it, I've eaten the entire box of Girl Scout cookies. And so I understand what addiction is like. Addiction is a very sensitive topic. I mean, and for any reason, I'm so glad that we have people people here that will pray for us, because somebody may say something that may hit you. You may, wow, I didn't, you just never know. I mean, just hearing my bio almost brought me to tears toward the end of it, because I'm like, man, I haven't read that in a while. I wrote that bio 7 years ago when I first started with Anesis. I did want to add additional things that I did not, probably to update my bio. Since the bio was written, I've actually became a psychotherapist. At the time, I was just a clinical substance abuse counselor, but now I do psychotherapy in addition. So, guess we can go ahead and get started. So today's agenda, we're going to define addiction, we're going to talk about how addiction affects the brain, we're going to talk about some risk factors, how we determine addiction, the criteria, screening tools. I'll be sharing information on screening tools for both self-assessment and for mental health professionals. We're going to talk about some types of addiction, we're going to talk about stages, interrupting the cycle, and the impact that addiction has on an individual. Now, hopefully we'll get through that. If we don't, then I try to put the most important stuff first. So, defining addictions, there are two, as I was researching, there's 2 or 3 definitions. There's probably a whole lot more that we could probably think of. Addiction is a psychological and physiological dependence. I recall hearing when I was younger, hey, someone's addicted, hey, you can stop. Willpower, you can do that. At the time I wasn't a Christian. Now that I'm a Christian, with God, yes, I can get through this. God puts professionals in my lives, I can get through this. So that is, an addiction is an inability to stop doing or using something, especially harmful. Later I'll be talking about some of the criteria, some of the things how you know that you have an addiction. Addiction involves a cycle of relapse and remission. Relapse, I reach a period where I'm abstinence, and then I relapse. There's a slip and a relapse. Slip, lapse, and relapse. Slip is, hey, I accidentally used, I really wasn't trying to. Maybe someone gave me something that has alcohol in it or substance in it, and I didn't know. Oops, I slipped. A lapse is, from my perspective, hey, I'm planning to drink just this one last time. I've been clean, but I'm planning to use just one time. I'm not going to do it anymore. Relapse is, hey, I've started using, so hey, I just might as well just continue to use. Remission is definitely the period where you're not using. Okay, you can go to the next slide. There is a similarity between behavior addiction and drug addiction. Behavior addiction, becoming obsessively preoccupied with an activity, object, or behavior. That includes gambling, sex, or any other type of behavior that is not beneficial for you, that can be harm, that can be harm, that you're referencing as harmful. And being unable to control that behavior. Continuing engaging in that behavior, having to engage more to get the pleasure that you are desiring. And we'll be talking more about the brain, the reward in the brain pathways and behavior addiction. So there's a comparison to the two, both behavior and drug addiction. Okay, I can go to the next slide. So here's a video, share a short video with you that talks about how substances hijack the brain. And I thought this was important because we sometimes, when we don't understand how a person that's addicted to substance or behavior, we don't understand that the brain is modified. The brain is not acting. It's not a normal brain anymore. I tell individuals, hey, the brain needs to be rewired. I use the analogy with walking across a yard and a pathway. You know, if you continue to walk across the yard, what's gonna happen? Eventually, you're gonna create a path. The way that we get the grass to grow back or repair it, we have to abstain from the behavior. So this video is gonna share some pretty information.
It's also called a substance use disorder. Over 20 million people nationwide suffer from addiction. 1 in 7 people will experience addiction at some point in their life. Scientists first began to understand addiction as a brain disorder back in the 1950s. Doctors Olds and Milner, in laboratory studies of rats, found the parts of the brain affected by addiction. But then in 1994, Doctors Volkoff and Schelberg, top neuroscientists, ran PET scans of the brain that showed the effects of substance use disorders. And like other diseases, these scans showed it affected tissue function. So there are 2 main parts of the brain affected by drug use: the limbic system and the cortex. The limbic system, located deep within the brain, is responsible for our basic survival instincts. So when you do essential things to stay alive, like eat, drink, find shelter, build relationships, or care for your young, your brain reinforces behaviors that cause the release of dopamine from this region. That reward for surviving is also transmitted to the amygdala and hippocampus, which records a memory of that feeling, so we seek it again. This is our survival hardwiring. Addiction also affects this area, up here. That's the prefrontal cortex, which is what separates us from other animals. And this is where decision-making and impulse control live. When drugs or alcohol are used, they activate the very same dopamine process in the survival center. And when use is repeated, that substance can hijack that part of the brain. This hijacker changes the brain and weakens this system to make it believe that the primary need for survival is the drug. In hijacking the brain, it can usurp those primary motivations: food, water, shelter, relationships, and protecting our young. And the hijacker needs more and more of the substance to activate the same level of reward or feeling of pleasure, causing the brain tissue to become increasingly damaged with continued drug use. So why don't all people who use alcohol or drugs become addicted? There are factors that contribute to the development of a substance use disorder. They include individual factors like your genes, your age of exposure, and then environmental factors like drug availability. But there is good news. Addiction is preventable. Key factors that aid in preventing addiction can be categorized into 2 parts: risk factors and protective factors. Protective factors range from parental involvement, programs that improve self-control, limiting availability, and increasing attachment to your community. Another key element in preventing substance use disorders is to delay when use begins. Put simply, prevention is about delaying the onset of first use. In the adolescent brain, where brain tissue is more vulnerable, the hijacker is more prone to weaken the brain and plant itself as a disease. Those with substance use disorders commonly initiate first use much earlier, between 12 and 18 years old, which increases the likelihood of the hijacker taking hold. But if the hijacker does take hold, addiction is treatable. Advancements have been made in assessments, treatment programs, recovery supports, and medications to treat addiction. Brain scans show that once in recovery, the tissue in the limbic system and cortex can get better. With your help, we can expand these innovations to help millions of individuals and families and ensure that addiction is treated as the medical issue that it is. Together, we can solve this. Join us.
Thank you. It shares a lot. I had just I read a book about the hijack brain, and when I ran across this video, I thought it was so fitting for the topic. Go to the next. So, I mentioned about the criteria. These are the criteria for how you determine if someone has a substance use, an addiction issue. If there's cravings, if you find yourself craving for the substance, whether it's daily, weekly, hourly, there's probably some concerns that you have. Probably need to explore that and give it some thought. If you're wanting to cut down and you're not able to, I'm only gonna go out and I'm only gonna have one drink, or I'm gonna just do this one time, and you're finding yourself wanting to do more. If you are taking the substance in larger amounts for longer than you meant to, neglecting other parts of your life because of the use. If the behavior is causing you to not function daily, normally, if it's interfering with your work, job, school, or home, there's more than likely there's an issue. Continue to use even when it's causing problems in the relationship. Using substance even when it puts you in danger. Driving while under the influence of anything, if that's something that an individual is doing, then there's criteria for substance use disorder. You can go to the next slide. Next, I'm going to be talking about some different screenings, tools for professionals and for self. The ASAM is a screening tool that professionals can use to determine an individual's level of care to be provided for the individual based upon the substance use or mental health disorder. The DSM-5 is what we use to diagnose, to determine if it's the severity of the disorder. Screening in alcohol, brief assessments for youth. This is something that we use to assess youth for use. The screening to brief intervention, that's something that it's another tool that we can use. Brief screening for alcohol and drug. I threw 3 of them on there for the sexual addiction screening tools. And all of these are accessible on the internet. So if you happen to want to just go and take a look at them, sexual addiction, and the last one, the pornographic addiction screening tool. You can go to the next slide. These specifically are tools that individuals can use for yourself. The first screen was for professionals. This is something that you can use on yours to help gauge whether or not. So the mask, the desk, the cage. Some of these are very short. I think the cage is probably one of the shorter ones. I think there's maybe like 5 or 6 questions on there to help you determine if substance use or is a problem, or addiction is a problem for you. Okay. The different types of addictions, there's drugs and alcohol, nicotine, behavior addictions include gambling, gaming, sexual. There may be others that may not be included on there. The cycle of addiction. So, the way that it works is a person engages in the initial use. First drink. Some substances are the chances of getting addicted is higher. So you may be, the chances are higher. For illicit use, initial use does not only include illicit use, but it also includes illicit use. Illicit use is substances that we shouldn't be taking. Heroin, cocaine, something that's not prescribed. Illicit is something that is a prescribed medication. You can become addicted to prescribed medication. Pain meds, for example. Our body can become dependent upon the pain meds, and we continuously take in them, and if we don't get them, it can cause some problems for us once our body becomes dependent upon them. Misuse, stage 2. Using medication or substances that are not prescribed for us, that would be an example of misuse. taking more than what we should be taking, not following the doctor's orders, or using someone else's medication. One of the big things is that I've run across in my practice is individuals using Adderall that's not prescribed. That would be an example of misuse. Tolerance. Having to take more to get the euphoric feeling or high that we once got. We like the way that the substance made us feel, so we have to take more to get that feeling. Dependence is when our body becomes dependent upon the substance. Our body can't function in a normal way unless we have the substance. That's important to know whenever an individual comes in and they say, hey, I have an addiction. What is your substance of choice? Heroin. Heroin is opiates. Treatment has to be a little different from talk therapy alone is not going to help someone with an opiate addiction. So we need to need a little bit more information on that. The addiction, the 5th stage is when we become addicted. We have to have it. Our body needs it. And the 6th stage is relapse. It's after we have, as I mentioned earlier, been engaged in a period of abstinence, and then we return back to the substance use. You can move to the next stage. Next slide. So the way that we interrupt the cycle, we can seek therapy, professional help. Some of the interventions that we use is cognitive behavioral therapies. Recovery coaches is another way of connecting with support, peer support groups, or develop some coping strategies. Addiction can have an impact on from a social perspective, it can impact the family dynamics. If an individual is using that, can cause them to not be able to function normally within the household. There's social stigma that's tied to people view you differently. Hey, you're an addict, or individuals may not want to go out and socialize with people, their friends anymore, because they are a fear of being judged. There's financial consequences. Addiction can cause you to spend more money than you would need to be to take care of your family. That can lead to homelessness. There's also legal and criminal consequences that are associated with addiction. Okay. Psychological impact, it messes with our learning. I have clients who have a strong desire to use marijuana. They may not remember what we talked about the last session. Now, they may forget when their appointments are. Judgment. It's one of the other things. It can affect your decision making. It can cause you stress. I know a lot of times individuals use substances to reduce their stress. Actually, substances, it may temporarily, but it's going to, when it's not there, it's going to make it worse. Anxiety is a big thing. People that struggle with anxiety, one of the first questions I ask them is, are you engaging in any substance use? Yes. Whenever you don't have it, it can heighten your anxiety. It can mess with your, as I said, memory, and it can definitely mess with impact your behavior. Okay. Treatments, addiction, like other diseases, are preventable, they're treatable. It changes the biology of the body, can lead to mortality or morbidity, and negatively impacts the quality of life of an individual. Okay, move to the next one. So some points that I want you to take from this is all individuals addicted do not choose to be addicts. Sometimes we're given medication for pain medication. Pain medication from prescribed by the doctor is one of the things that, I didn't choose to do. I took this medication because I wanted to be comfortable. Substance use does not help to improve mental health symptoms. It actually worsens them. Illicit substance use. Porn is not sex, they are two different things. I know I didn't touch on a lot about the sex addiction, but I'm open. I'll be around for the entire, even if you have any questions about that. Have empathy with individuals battling with addiction. I was watching a video, and you may see that later on in the presentation, is the best, one of the good ways to deal with addiction is to support the individual, love on the individual. Drug use of any types that same surface of the brain as they do behavior. So drug use affects the surface of the brain the same way that unwanted behaviors do. Drug use causes a surge in the levels of, and that is something that that was presented in the video about how the drug use overloads the dopamine, overloads the brain. And so I guess one of the ways that what I got from that is the brain makes the dopamine. When we get the substance, when we bring in extra dopamine, the brain realizes, hey, I'm getting too much. So the brain stops making the dopamine, and then we have to get it from the substances. And that's a pleasure. And the last one, the genetic factors account for 40 to 60% of a person's vulnerability to addiction. So genetics pays on. And these are just some resources that I have that I use in the PowerPoint. This PowerPoint will be available for you guys afterwards if you want it. And go to the next slide. So I wanted to include a scripture according to addiction. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. And that's 1 Corinthians. God will always give you the strength to stay sober if you trust him. God puts people in our lives to be support to us. I remember once, years ago, I thought that, hey, I'm involved in a church, and whenever I get sick, I don't have to go to the doctor. I believe that God is going to heal me. With prayer, fasting, God is going to heal me. And so I remember a point in my life where I got really sick, and I wouldn't go to the doctor, and my family members are like, you need to go get yourself taken care of. And so they called one of my uncles was a pastor. He said, son, God heals through doctors. God heals through professionals. So you can go to the next slide. Questions?
So Kevin, we got some questions come in, and so if you're okay with that, I'll just kind of ask
Sure.
them, the ones we have, and then you can
Sure.
then we can go from there. So as you feel comfortable responding, have you beaten your sugar addiction, and if so, what steps did you personally take?
So, yes, I have. So during my coursework, I was introduced to a 30-day abstinence program. And so I agreed to it. So what I did is I developed some internal motivators to help me reach a period of abstinence and maintain it. So what I did is I thought about, okay, if I stay away from sugar, what are the benefits for me? So, it's going to help me health-wise. It's going to prevent me, there's possibility that it can prevent me from getting diabetes and other health issues. weight-wise, it'll help me with that. So I identified internal motivators to help me abstain from the sugar. So what I would do, each and every day, I would do some positive self-talk. Okay, today, Kevin, you're not going to do sugar because you're gonna reflect on your internal motivators. And that was the way that was how I beat the sugar.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So next question, when speaking of addiction, how do you suggest addressing addictions that are on their face bad and serve no purpose, such as alcohol, drugs, or porn, versus something that is good and can be misused and cannot be solved by an abstinent-only solution, food, working out, time and community, etc.
So the question was, how do I address, how do you
How do
address
you,
it?
yes, how would you address the addictions that are from substances that are like bad versus just something that might be good used for bad?
One of the ways that I would do that is I would look at what are the disadvantages of me not engaging in the substance or the behavior. I would first identify those. And I know that sounds kind of weird. What are the disadvantages of me not drinking or not using substances? And for some people, there are disadvantages. I know that sounds kind of weird, like, wow, what? There's no disadvantages if I don't use or I don't. But, you know, for people that are using pain meds, that are addicted to pain meds, the disadvantages to not using is I'm going to experience withdrawal symptoms that are going to be unbearable. So that would be the first thing. Then I would identify the advantages of staying away from the substances or the behavior, the unwanted behavior.
Have you experienced counseling people or doing psychotherapy with people who have like something good in and of itself has turned into something that's really addictive? Like food, I mean, we talked about food, but like relationships, working out, things like that.
Interesting question. I had a client once that said, hey, I switched from drugs to working out every day, and I'm at the gym for 3 or 4 times a day, 5 to 7 days a week. And I kind of use that same scenario of what are the disadvantages of you not? If you stop going to the gym, what are the advantages? What are some other things that you can do other than just going to the gym? Or what other supports do you have in place? What are some other hobbies that you have? Because sometimes if that's the only route that you know, that's the road that you take.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, next question. How would you describe the difference between porn and sex? We kind of touched on that.
Porn and sex. So, let me. Porn is probably not something that we should be doing. Sex was designed for us to. So from a spiritual perspective, that is probably how I would define it. In summary.
What are some of the negative consequences you see from people who are using porn instead of engaging in healthy sexual behaviors?
It can cause problems in a marriage. It can recondition your brain to make you feel as if you're, it can lead to masturbation for once. And that masturbation can cause you to feel as if you're the only person that can please you. No one else can please you. Trying to think of some other things that porn could probably lead to open up other avenues and other issues. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've got one more that came in through Q&A. Oh, no, there's more coming. So I'm gonna keep going this route because then it's anonymous. I don't want someone to feel like you have to raise your hand and ask a scary question, but So the next question is, the video talks about the brain, specifically from a substance perspective. Is the brain also affected similarly from a behavioral addiction? And in what ways are the effects different on the brain?
Well, I guess if you think about it from a pleasure perspective, that's kind of how I thought about it. I thought about the reward system and dopamine. There are things, dopamine can come from things that we do that are pleasurable. If there's a specific food that we like, as I was doing research, I ran across that. I'm like, okay. I did have a part of my slide, I took it out, that it talked about how the level of dopamine that's produced by different things. So, different foods, behavior. So, when we find something pleasurable, it is associated with dopamine. There are natural ways that we can create dopamine too. So, when I think about how the video, I think about it from a pleasure perspective. As we know that engaging in sexual behavior is pleasure. When we allow it to, from a drug perspective, that behavior overloads the dopamine on our brain, and it sends a surge down through the pathways of the brain. And that's what, as I mentioned, the brain realizes that there's an external way that I'm getting this dopamine. And we want the pleasure, so in order for us to get the pleasure that we're desiring, we resort to outside sources, behavior, whether it's behavior or substances.
Yeah, so it sounds like either way, there are certain behaviors that also provide an excess of dopamine.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then the next question, if we naturally seek dopamine since it's a reward mechanism of the brain, then aren't we naturally addictive? If we are, then will we replace one addiction for another?
There have been cases, yes, we do replace one addiction for the other. I stopped smoking, or I stopped using heavy drugs, and I resorted to using drugs that are less harmful, or engaging in other behavior that. So there are cases where individuals do replace one addiction for another. There's a thing that we have in addiction, it's called harm reduction. And it's, we encourage individuals to, if individuals don't want to go the abstinence route, they can use the harm reduction route. Or if they do want to do the abstinence route, we use a harm reduction model to at least help them work toward reducing the harm that the substance or the behavior is causing.
Yeah, could you, for people who aren't in the field, could you describe a little bit of what some of those mechanisms are for harm reduction?
An example of harm reduction would be an individual that was addicted to marijuana. They're smoking every day. One of the things that I would do with an individual is say, hey, what are some coping skills that have there ever been a time where you did not use these substances? What was it like for you when you didn't use these substances? And if they're able to identify, I don't. There have been times when I stopped. Okay, what was that like for you? What strategies or what did you do? Well, I found other things to get engaged. So what we do is we work on, okay, let's set a goal for us to maybe work toward, instead of smoking every day, pick a day in the week. And then let's develop a plan to be abstinence for that one day. Just pick one day that we're not going to do anything. And what are some things that we could do? What are some other things that we could do other than use substances? or engage in behavior. That's one route. And as they keep coming, we continuously work down until we get to wherever they want to get to, whatever their goal is. If it's abstinence, great, or if they just want, I just want to use recreational, or if, I've had people say, I just want to develop a professional relationship with alcohol. So I just want to be sociable. I don't want to be, having to go out and have 3 or 4 drinks.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're filling in, instead of just like, don't do it, stop.
Yeah.
You're
just-
filling in what's those pleasurable, healthy
Mhm.
actions, yeah, okay.
Some other harm, when I think of harm reduction, is there are clinics who thrive on harm reduction for individuals who are intravenous users. They will provide them with clean needles, anything that can do, anything that can help them reduce the harm of causing more harm on themselves.
Okay, those are the questions that came in. We have a few more minutes if there's any questions. Yes, I will come to you with the microphone so we can all hear.
I guess the question I have is, I have a lot of questions, but I'm thinking about, as a person who loves somebody with an addiction, trying to navigate that and be loving. And I think what's I'm carrying right now, after hearing you talk, is what is my responsibility to continue to acknowledge both that I love you, but I also see what you're doing. And I think that there's a tendency to want to pretend that's not happening. And you don't want to jeopardize the relationship. So your advice, like, what is my responsibility, and when do I need to get support?
That's a good one. My advice, one of the things that how I would handle that is to let them know that I love you and I understand what it is that you are experiencing. I want to walk alongside you in this journey. Let me know, and therefore you let me know if there's anything that I can do to support you, because I love you and I care about you. And I care about your well-being. That would be my approach.
Yeah, we're gonna have, actually the whole second talk is on supporting others with addictions and what that looks like. So I know it's like, I mean, this first topic is a heavy topic. It's a lot of information, but it just brings up so much for all of us. And so we will get more into the support conversation. We're gonna take a break soon. Do you have any last things you wanted to say before we go for break?
I did want to, I'm not sure if the next slide provided my contact information. I did not put my credentials on there. I guess that's the humility part of me. But I can be contacted at that phone number. That is a direct number that comes to me. If you have any additional questions, want to know about any additional resources, feel free to contact me. And I will be around for the entire program here today. So if you see me, grab me, and I'm open to that. Thank you guys for your attention and your time, and you guys continue to be blessed today.
So in the last session, we talked specifically about like some of the ways to like identify addiction, how it progresses, those sorts of things, which can be really helpful to observe, even if you're an advocate. just being familiar with that stuff can just be really helpful to just get a sense of where somebody's at without trying to give them some kind of professionalized care. Dani Ebben's going to be next. Her work is in counseling people in substance abuse, just day in and day out. She's going to talk about like walking with people and some other stuff like that. So I'm going to also read her intro, and then she's going to get in and just give you both barrels. Okay, so here we go. Dani Ebben is a master's level therapist with a master's degree in social work from George Williams College in Williams Bay. She's been working in the field since 2018 and has experience working with kids, teens, and adults. Dani's also a substance abuse counselor and has worked with various substance use disorders in teens and adults and in a partial hospitalization setting. Dani also has experience working with various mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, trauma, abuse, self-harm, relationship struggles, and addiction. Dani's therapy style focuses on challenging our thought process to be in line with things of Christ so that our lifestyle will follow. Dani counts it a privilege to work alongside all clients she counsels, making the therapy room a safe place to empower them to reach their goals and find hope in Jesus Christ. Dani is a member of the American Association of Christian Counselors. As your mom, Dani, also one thing she was sharing before is that a lot of her clients aren't professing believers. And so she's got that perspective as well, that sometimes we're going to have people come to church or we may be serving them here and they don't already believe in Jesus. And so working with a set of principles or dynamics in our life, well, we're going to tell them about Jesus, but until then we're working with a pre-Jesus set of dynamics. I think Dani has a lot of experience with that as well, so we enjoy it. I learn a lot from what she has to share.
Kind of like what Kevin said, man, I have not heard that bio in a long time. Wrote that a couple years ago. I mean, it's all true, but I would say that today my two specialties are trauma and addiction. And to be honest with you, I think that professionally, if you specialize in one of those, it's going to be pretty necessary that you specialize in both, because we're batting almost 1,000 as far as what is the crossover between those two things with trauma and addictive behaviors or compulsive behaviors. Okay, it can kind of become this question of which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, the trauma we experienced, and then we developed a addictive or compulsive behavior, or did we have an addictive behavior first, and then in that lifestyle experience some trauma? So it really is a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg then. I titled my talk, Loving Through the Pain, and I think that title actually goes really well with the question that was asked after Kevin's talk, okay? Because coming alongside somebody who is struggling with addiction, there is pain on both sides, both for the person who is struggling with addiction, as well as it can be a very difficult and painful thing to support and love somebody who is struggling, because likely we have been hurt along that path as well, okay? So I just think that pairs really well with that question that was asked. Unlike Evan, I'm not a walker, but I do use my hands a lot, so if you can't hear me, it's probably because the microphone's all the way up here. I use my hands a lot, guys. All right. Behind every quote-unquote bad behavior is a good intent. Basically what that quote means to me is that addiction or an addictive behavior of any kind often gets looked at as a bad behavior. Okay, we focus on the behavior and we say, well, why can't you just stop? Do you see all of the bad things that it is doing? Okay, but one of the things that can be harder to recognize is the need that's behind that behavior, because behind that behavior is a very good need that person is trying to fulfill. And if we can look past the behavior and see their heart and see what need are they trying to fulfill through this behavior, but they're missing the mark, right? They have a need, they think they found the solution, but they're forcing a square peg into a round hole, okay? Look for the need, not necessarily the behavior. Next slide. Okay, agenda and goals. I threw some stuff up there. those are the things I intend to go over, okay? Whether or not those are the things I actually go over, we will see. Kevin and I were both talking before this, like, hey, whatever needs to get talked about is what's gonna get talked about, and whatever doesn't, isn't, right? So those are the things in the PowerPoint. First and foremost, leaving uncomfortability about addiction at the door. This is especially relevant for this talk about how to support and love people through the struggles, okay? If we're uncomfortable about the topic of addiction, if we're uncomfortable about the behavior, the vice, it's gonna show, okay? So we have to push past that uncomfortability from the get-go and be willing to get messy and sit in that mess, okay? Reflections, definitions. We will go over building blocks of support, one at a time. And then at the end, I just threw in some scriptural references because, believe it or not, the biblical and clinical actually work really well together, and they do support one another, okay? Yeah, go ahead and, in the spirit of leaving uncomfortability about addiction at the door, I am gonna play a TED Talk. It's about 10 minutes, so get comfy, okay? I tried to shorten it as much as I could, but it's really, really good, and I am willing to give up this much of my talking time, and if you know me, you know I really like to talk. So I'm willing to give up this much of my talking time for this video. See you in about 10 minutes.
Okay. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drug water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's how we think it works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. Now, when I first saw this, Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a thing about rats, they're quite different to us, maybe not as different as we'd like, but but fortunately there was a human experiment into the exact same principle happening at the exact same time. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that, because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. That's what we want as human beings. And I think, at first I found this quite a difficult thing to get my head around, but one way that helped me to think about it is, I can see, I've got over by my seat there a bottle of water, right? I'm looking at lots of you, and lots of you have bottles of water with you, right? Forget drugs, forget the drug war. Totally legally, all of those bottles of water could be bottles of vodka, right? We could all be getting drunk, I might after this. But we're not, right? Now, because you've been able to afford the approximately a gazillion pounds that it costs to get into a TED Talk, I'm guessing you guys could afford to be drinking vodka for the next 6 months. You wouldn't end up homeless. You're not going to do that. And the reason you're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping you. It's because you've got bonds and connections that you want to be present for. You've got work you love, you've got people you love, you've got healthy relationships. And a core part of addiction, I came to think, and I believe the evidence suggests, is about not being able to bear to be present in your life. Now, this has really significant implications. The most obvious implications are for the war on drugs, right? In Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to wear t-shirts saying I was a drug addict and go out on chain gangs and dig graves while members of the public would jeer at them. And when those women get out of prison, they're going to have criminal records that mean they'll never work in the legal economy again. Now that's a very extreme example, obviously in the case of the chain gang, but actually almost everywhere in the world we treat addicts to some degree like that. We punish them, we shame them, we give them criminal records, we put barriers between them reconnecting. There was a doctor in Canada, Dr. Gabor Mate, an amazing man, who said to me, if you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you would design that system. Now, there's a place that decided to do the exact opposite, and I went there to see how it worked. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year, they tried the American way more and more. They punished people and stigmatized them and shamed them more. And every year, the problem got worse. And one day, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't go on with a country where we're having ever more people becoming heroin addicts. Let's set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. And they set up a panel led by an amazing man called Dr. João Goulão to look at all this new evidence. And they came back and they said, decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, on disconnecting them, and spend it instead on reconnecting them with the society. And that's not, essentially, that's not really what we think of. What they did wasn't really what we think of as drug treatment in the United States and Britain. So they do residential rehab, they do psychological therapy that does have some value. But the biggest thing they did was the complete opposite of what we do. A massive program of job creation for addicts and micro loans for addicts to set up small businesses. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. And when I went and met the addicts in Portugal, it was fascinating. What they said is, as they rediscovered purpose, they rediscovered bonds and relationships with the wider society. It'll be 15 years this year since that experiment began, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal, according to the British Journal of Criminology, by 50%, 50%. Overdose is massively down, HIV is massively down among addicts, addiction in every study is significantly down. One of the ways you know it's worked so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back to the old system. Now that's the kind of political implications. I actually think there's a layer of implications to all this research below that. You know, we live in a culture where people feel really increasingly vulnerable to all sorts of addictions, whether it's to their smartphones, or to shopping, or to eating. You know, before these talks began, you guys know this, that we were told we weren't allowed to have our smartphones on. And I have to say, a lot of you looked an awful lot like addicts who were being told their dealer was going to be unavailable for the next couple of hours. And yeah, a lot of us feel like that. And it might sound weird to say, oh, you know, I've been talking about how disconnection is a major driver of addiction. But weird to say it's growing because you think, well, we're the most connected society there's ever been, surely. But I increasingly began to think that the connection we have, the connections we have, we think we have, are like a kind of parody of human connection. If you have a crisis in your life, you'll notice something. It won't be your Twitter followers who come to sit with you. It won't be your Facebook friends who help you turn it around. It'll be your flesh and blood friends who you have deep and nuanced and textured face-to-face relationships with. And I think there's a study I learned about from Bill McKibben, the environmental writer, I think tells us a lot about this. It looked at the number of close friends the average American believes they can call on in a crisis. That number has been declining steadily since the 1950s. The amount of floor space an individual has in their home has been steadily increasing. And I think that's like a metaphor for the choice we've made as a culture, right? We've traded floor space for friends, we've traded stuff for connections, and the result is that we are one of the loneliest societies there has ever been. And yet, Bruce Alexander, the guy who did the Rat Park experiment, says, we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery. And it's right to talk about that. But we need to talk much more about social recovery. Something's gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And we've created a society where, for a lot of us, life looks a whole lot more like that isolated cage and a whole lot less like Rat Park. if I'm honest, this isn't why I went into it, right? I didn't go in to discover the political stuff, the social stuff. I wanted to know how to help the people I love. And when I came back from this long journey and I'd learned all this, I looked at the addicts in my life, and if you're really candid, it's hard loving an addict, and there's going to be lots of people who know in this room you are angry a lot of the time. And I think one of the reasons why this debate is so charged is because it runs through the heart of each of us, right? Everyone has a bit of them that looks at an addict and thinks, I wish someone would just stop you. And the kind of script we're told for how to deal with the addicts in our lives is typified by the reality show Intervention. If you guys haven't seen it, I think everything in our lives is typified by reality TV, but that's another TED Talk. If you've never seen the show Intervention, it's a pretty simple premise. You get an addict, all the people in their life, gather them together and say, if you don't shape up, they confront them with what they're doing, and they say, if you don't shape up, we're going to cut you off, right? So what they do is they take the connection to the addict and they threaten it. They make it contingent on the addict behaving the way they want. And I began to see why that approach doesn't work. And I began to think that almost that's like the importing of the logic of the drug war into our private lives. So I was thinking, well, how can I be Portuguese, right? And what I try to do now, and I can't tell you I do it consistently, and I can't tell you it's easy, is to say to the addicts in my life that I want to deepen the connection with them, to say to them, I love you whether you're using or you're not. I love you whatever state you're in, and if you need me, I'll come and sit with you, because I love you and I don't want you to be alone or to feel alone. And I think the core of that message, you're not alone, we love you, has to be at every level of how we respond to addicts, socially, politically, and individually. For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about addicts. I think all along we should have been singing love songs to them, because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to start with that, sort of as the preface of our talk, okay? To highlight the important role that each of us have as a support person and as a loved one of somebody who is struggling, okay? Now that's not to say that you are responsible for them, that's not to say that you are responsible for their recovery, for their sobriety, because you're not. Each person is responsible for themselves, but you can and do play a vital role in loving people and in connecting with people, okay? You don't have to have all of the right answers. You don't have to be able to answer all of their questions. You just need to be able to be with. It comes down to that. You need to be able to be with them, okay? So a little bit more just about shaking off that uncomfortability, okay? Again, we can get very focused on the behavior when we have to remember we're just supporting people. We're people. We know how to talk to other people. We know how to connect with other people, okay? That's what we're doing. Person first, right? A lot of that has to do with how we think about them and how we talk to or about them, right? Rather than use the term addict or junkie or terms you hear a lot in the media, right? It's a person who struggles with an addiction or a person with an addictive behavior. Well, they probably have a name, so you could use their name too. Probably works, okay? Remember that nobody wakes up deciding that they want to have an addiction. No 5-year-old in kindergarten wrote that down when they were asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Not a single kindergartner. What I did write down was I wanted to own a Taco Bell. I'm not there yet, but that is what I wrote down at 5 years old. My parents are still proud of my career choice, but they're still holding out on the Taco Bell. All right, so what is the why or the wound? Because there is one, okay? I did not put that down because it's our job to figure it out. okay? It's not our job to dig into their life and say, well, I need to know and I need to know how to fix. No, you don't, okay? But to understand that there is a deeper wound or a deeper reason can help with a lot of the building blocks of what it looks like to support that we'll get to, things like empathy, compassion, accountability, all of that, okay? Those things are made easier when we understand that there is a why, whether that person decides to tell us what it is or not, okay? And I think when we recognize that there is a why and we see that hurt, again, it changes how we view the person and it changes how we talk to them. It changes that, okay? And if there was no why, with all due respect to the great work that DARE was trying to do, DARE would have been the school program that went in, right? They would have been a lot more effective, okay? They did not get great results when they went into schools because it was kind of the, we'll just stop, just don't do it type of approach, okay? I put a quote in here by Dr. Glenn Doyle, a psychiatrist in the field that I think is very, very powerful. And honestly, it could be a heck of a lot longer. But it says, you do not just treat addiction. You end up treating anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, loneliness, rage, despair, toxic secrets, regret, undiagnosed head trauma, untreated ADHD, etc. And then you begin to realize that addiction is often someone's best way to cope when they did not see other options. So it is a maladaptive coping strategy. Okay, I told you guys at the very beginning, trauma and addiction are my two specialties, and I really think that those two have to go together because we have to be able to treat all of the other things, or at least hear about all of those other things when we are supporting somebody who's struggling with an addictive behavior, okay? And something I did want to mention too, and I will do it here because I don't believe it's on a slide. Kevin alluded to this as well, but as clinicians, we see kind of two, I'm hesitant to say categories, but people that are on two different paths as far as treatment. Okay, you have people who are dependent on something and are going for the abstinence route, and then you have people who maybe they're not dependent, but they abuse something, okay? And so then you're maybe not going for the abstinence route. I will ask them for abstinence for a certain amount of time at the beginning to help me discern where they are, okay? I will ask for abstinence at the beginning. However, then we're going for either harm reduction or management of whatever the thing is, because say somebody's vice is food. I'm not gonna ask you to abstain from food because I'm not here to do more harm than good. But we need to alter our relationship to that thing and utilize it in the way that God intended, right? So two different types of people that we're working with here. Okay, next slide. Okay, some quick definitions. Pretty simple, but support, to bear all or part of the weight of, to hold up. Again, does not mean you are responsible for the person, but we need to be able to love them when they cannot love themselves. We need to be able to hold them up when it's too heavy for them, okay? A thing that bears the weight of something or keeps it upright. So again, we're not doing the work for them, but we can help them keep doing the work for themselves. Healthy support is a fine line, okay? It's a very, very fine line. And it lies somewhere between enabling the behavior and shaming and judging the behavior. So if you find yourself leaning towards either one of those, we may want to re-examine our approach to healthy supporting, right? It's not black and white. We don't want to fall either to enabling them, but we sure as heck don't want to shame or judge the person because they did not choose to be here, okay? The biggest differences that I see personally between enabling and truly supporting are healthy boundaries, truly loving them, and then accountability, providing accountability. There's probably others, but when I was writing this, those are the first three things that came to my mind. On boundaries, didn't put this in there, but keyword, healthy. healthy boundaries. Just because we have boundaries doesn't mean they're healthy ones. All right, we'll go over that. Oxytocin. Our brain has what are called the 4 happy chemicals. We don't have a better clinical word for them. So, oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, and endorphins. Oxytocin is one that is at play as far as connecting with other people and when we are loving another person or a pet. Honestly, oxytocin is released when we cuddle our pets too. Okay. The impact of 2020, and I will not be making any political statements or siding with anything. I just looked up, I started to look up statistics on the impact of the lockdown, okay, on substance abuse disorders and alcohol use disorders. I stopped looking because it was so much. And I was like, you know what? We're not putting anything in the PowerPoint. Just know it got bad, okay? The lockdown increased everything for everyone, right? I looked at patterns for different race demographics, different age demographics. Everything went up. Didn't matter, age, race, whatever, went up, okay? Again, not here to be for or against anything that went down. I'm just telling you the impact of immediate isolation that we did not choose drastically impacted how people were coping and their ability to regulate themselves in a healthy way. Okay, so substance use and alcohol use went way up. Next one. Addiction in teens versus adults. Some important things to think about is the role of peer pressure. Understand that with teenagers, they do not have a fully formed brain. Does not mean they are dumb. I don't know if we have any teenagers in here. Physically, before the age of 25, you do not have a fully formed brain. And the last part of your brain to form is the frontal lobe, which handles your critical thinking, your decision making, your logic and reasoning. Okay? Went to a wedding recently, and the DJ thought he was really funny, and he said, anybody over the age of 25 is allowed to cut their own cake. If you're not over the age of 25, somebody has to do it for you because you're not going to do it right. And the child went up there, cut a piece out of the middle of the cake. Okay? So understand that in teenagers, we have to have a presence in their life. We have to, not saying it's a dictatorship, but when it comes down to it, being a safe person that they can talk to is important, okay? A lot of times when I work with teenagers on whether it's trauma, addiction, other things, right? One of the common reasons why things start in a bad direction is because they say, well, I couldn't talk to my parents. I knew they wouldn't listen, or I knew they wouldn't care. So I decided to figure it out for myself. I decided to start looking stuff up on the internet. That is actually the leading reason why people find pornography. Is because as a teenager, they're starting to be sexually curious, which developmentally is very appropriate. But sex was a topic that the family took off the table. So they could not ask their parents. Okay? Be available for the conversation. It's the number one thing you can do. Next slide. Okay, these are the building blocks that we are going to go over. All of them are fairly brief. And I should say too, I know people are taking pictures of it, which is great. Are the slides gonna be available? They are. Okay, Jill says yes, the slides are going to be available. Don't know when, don't know where. Jill's got it. Okay, but these are all the building blocks that we are going to go over. So let's start off with self-care, please. The analogy that I use for self-care is, if you have ever flown in an airplane before, the stewardess or steward at the front, right? They're doing the whole arrows, this thing, and then they talk about the air masks that fall from the sky in the event of an emergency, okay? What do they tell you every single time? Put yours on before you help the person next to you. Every single time. That is what self-care looks like. okay? It is not you being a jerk. It is not you being the negative connotation of selfish, because I wish selfish had a more positive connotation in some terms, or in some instances, okay? But we have to make sure that we are in a good place to help somebody else. Otherwise, we are the blind leading the blind. Okay? So are we in a position to be of help to them? Right? What does it look like to maintain our own health physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, relationally? Have we thought about all of those pillars in our own life to make sure we are the best person to be helping that individual? Okay? Again, it can be a messy process if our life has been touched and pain is in our life because of addiction. We have to deal with that pain before we can help the person with their pain. If I'm helping somebody out of a place of pain and anger, it's not going to be good for either of us. We have to address our own pain first. Okay? What are our beliefs and our biases about addiction? We have to be honest with ourselves. Am I the best person again in that way, right? Do I have underlying beliefs or biases from upbringing or from teaching or, you know, whatever it is, but I gotta be honest with myself, okay? I put a scripture up here from Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. Greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." That verse gets talked about a lot to talk about how to love others and how to love God. Yes, that is in there. Yes, that is very important. But I think oftentimes we cut that verse off before we get to the end. If I am not loving myself in a healthy way, I cannot. It is not possible to love somebody else in a healthy way. It's not. Okay? So I almost think we need to read that verse backwards because we have to know what it looks like to love ourselves in the way that God does before we know what it looks like to love somebody else in the way that God does. Boundaries. My description of it is where I end and another person begins. That's just kind of my definition, right? So it's thinking about all areas of life: physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual, financial. I mean, man, you can keep going, but how much access do I want this person to have? And it's not even want. How much access is it healthy for this person to have to me? Okay? We do not have to give people full access to us, nor is that healthy. Keep in mind that a boundary is a bridge. It is not a brick wall. Okay? If we need to cut somebody off, that needs to be a brick wall. But a boundary is meant to preserve the relationship. So it's a bridge to say, hey, within these parameters, you and I are safe. You and I are okay. Once we step outside of these boundaries, things are getting a little bit murky. But it's gotta be on this bridge, you and I are okay. Okay? I can't pour from an empty cup. I think we've covered that frontwards and backwards. Allowing enough space so that we can make sure we're okay, and we also let the other person have access to us, and we still have that relationship. I think Kevin kind of answered the question at the end of his talk really well with that of, yes, I will allow you access to me. We also need to acknowledge that there are some issues here. Okay. The harm reduction approach, I think Kevin also talked about this nicely. He spoke about it more from like how a clinician will do harm reduction. There are ways that as a loved one, you guys can also do harm reduction, all right? Depending on where we are at in the cycle of addiction, things can get really bad, y'all, okay? Things can get really serious. So it might look like, because I love and care about you, I have to keep your keys until you're safe to drive, because you're not safe to drive right now, okay? Apply that to whatever it looks like for you with whatever the person's vice is, whatever behaviors they are exhibiting that are not safe for them, okay? If we are working to keep the person safe, I might tick somebody off, but it is okay to do something that they don't like. If it is to keep them safe, it is okay to do something that they are not a fan of, because it is to keep them safe. Okay? So it doesn't actually lower the behavior, but it lowers the risk associated with the behavior, right? So I didn't actually stop the person from drinking, but I did stop them from getting behind the wheel of the car when they drank. Okay, that doesn't control them, it controls what I can control, which is taking the keys. Listening and showing compassion, this is a big one. This is a big one. Okay, so active listening is to understand, it's not to respond. Right? So if I'm sitting in a therapy session while the person is talking and I'm spending the whole time going, okay, I cannot wait to say this to them. This is such a good point. I'm just gonna blow them away with when I say this, right? That's not a good therapy approach, y'all, because I have no clue what my client just said to me. They probably just made a really good point, right? I wasn't listening. I was too excited about how smart I am. Okay? So active listening is truly to understand, right? Even if it means silence. We have to be okay sitting in silence going, what did they actually just say to me? A question I'll ask in therapy sometimes, because information will go from my brain to my mouth and to the other person's ears and sound very different when it gets to their ears from when it was in my brain. I find myself asking often, wait a minute, what did you just hear me say? Because I have no clue. I think I know what I said, but I look at their face and I go, I don't think they heard what I just said. So what did you just hear me say? They need to know that we care and that we actually want to understand. No pressure to have all the answers, okay? The goal in supporting is for them to know that you care and to know that they are not alone. If you have done that, you have effectively supported somebody who struggles with an addiction. It can be as simple as that. We overcomplicate it so much. Even as therapists, I tell people it's not about me having the right answers. It's actually about me knowing what questions to ask. That's really what it is, because you have the information. I just have the questions that get you there. Okay. All right, detach. This is an acronym that is used, if anybody has ever heard of Al-Anon meetings, okay? So meetings for people who struggle with an addiction would be AA, NA, Celebrate Recovery, Smart Recovery, all that. But Al-Anon is a meeting for the affected loved ones, okay? And an acronym that they use is detach. It stands for don't even think about changing him or her. If that is your goal, we have started off on the wrong foot. The goal is not to change the other person. It is to change how we approach them and our relationship with them. All right? And a big part of that is not taking their successes or their missteps personally. Because they're not gonna get clean or sober because of you, and they're not gonna relapse because of you. Neither of those are true. Okay. Speaking the truth in love, another one that's very clinical and biblical, right? This first starts with building rapport and respect. I will tell you, I'm the therapist at my clinic who calls our office manager and says, you know, I've had the soft, gentle, rub my back, tell me I'll be fine approach. That didn't work so well. So do you have anybody that's gonna tell me like it is? And she says, boy, do I. She's 5'3" standing up, which she doesn't do, and she's very feisty, okay? But a part of why I can do that is because I spend a lot of time at the beginning building respect with the person and building rapport. I'm not gonna start day one and be like, yeah, how'd that work out for you? Not so great? Okay, right? They have to know that we respect them and that we're there to help. Love does not mean lying or not being truthful, and being truthful doesn't mean we are not loving. Those two can go together very well. Very, very well. And they have to go together. If we are falling too far on the loving side, more than likely we're closing in on enabling. If we're falling too far on the truthful side, more than likely we're closing in on the shaming and judging. We have to walk that center line, okay? Grace and compassion are very important with that. Sorry, that's all I want to say. Healthy distractions for somebody that is in recovery. Okay, part of this has to do with like not needing to have all the answers. All of your interactions with them also don't need to be about their addictive behavior. Who wants to hang out with somebody that every single time you know, oh my gosh, we're gonna have to talk about pornography again, we're gonna have to talk about alcohol, like, right? Even in counseling, sometimes we do random stuff that doesn't feel related and it's kind of fun because we need to be able to have fun. If you remember from the video, we talked about connection. Healthy connection is not just, let's talk about one topic. Let's talk about the quote unquote bad thing or the elephant in the room. Integrate them into a part of your life. Invite them to things. Let them be a part of a normal life, because true recovery, there's a big difference between clean and in recovery. Clean means I'm abstaining or I'm managing the thing. Awesome. I will celebrate that with anybody. Now let's get into recovery. Okay, recovery is, am I having healthy interactions with other people? Do I have healthy hobbies? Am I okay with boredom? Am I doing the deep work of how we got here in the first place? Right? The bio-psycho-social spiritual approach. Am I addressing all four of those pillars? Then I am in recovery. But they have to be integrated into our regular daily lives to find that life that they can enjoy without needing their vice. So I like to say focus on the yeses of life, not the nos. Okay? Doesn't work very well, even with kids, if all we do is just say, no, don't do that. No, don't do that. No, you can't do that. Because now they're going, what? Give me an option. What can I do? Keep getting into trouble because all I know is what I can't do. Give them something to do. Give them something to do. Okay, so focus on the yeses and don't make it weird. Don't make it weird, guys. Okay, again, if we're uncomfortable, they're gonna know about it. I've got a whole lot of stories about that, but we're gonna continue because I'm probably gonna be late. Sorry, Joe. Accountability. Okay? Now I'm gonna not reverse what I said, but don't allow the distractions to become avoidance. This is where that speaking the truth in love comes into play, right? Hey, you know, we've been hanging out a lot lately and it's been fun and you know, all of that. We haven't really checked in on how you're actually doing lately. How are you really doing? What's going on? Give me the highs and lows, right? We have to not allow distractions to become that avoidance, okay? And if we're gonna follow up, we gotta follow through. Gotta go both directions, follow up and follow through. If you say you're gonna do something, you gotta do it. Stay consistent, that means the same thing. Please be mindful of who is working harder in that person's recovery. It cannot be you if you are the one supporting, okay? Our job is to help remove the barriers for them to take the steps. It's my job to help open that door and let them walk through it. I cannot be the one that is working harder. I cannot be dragging them kicking and screaming, because what I find down the road is then there's resentment towards me because I made them do it. It's gotta be because they want to, but we can absolutely help remove some of the barriers to make it easier for them to take the steps. Okay. Grief and patience. This one is incredibly important, okay? I sat across from an older gentleman once who one of his vices, among a few, was smoking, cigarettes. And it was physically killing him. Okay? And it continued at a daily, and I'm not just talking one a day, it's pretty constant. And it was physically killing him. Okay? And to a person who doesn't understand addiction, it didn't make any sense. Like, why would you not stop? There are procedures you can't have because of this. Like, you can't, right? Like, this is getting in the way of your life, and this is a train that we can't stop. He looked at me one day and he said, Dani, how do you expect me to say goodbye to the only thing that has been my friend since I was 8 years old? the only thing or person. Okay? That is sometimes what we're dealing with. We have to understand that this person is essentially writing a goodbye letter to their vice, and that is a big deal. And that is something worth being patient with. That is something worth letting them grieve. It is worth having kindness and compassion. Okay? There's so many other things at play here, right? We didn't even touch on dopamine, right? But the dopamine rush that we get when we view things like pornography or when we utilize a substance, right? Or we develop an unhealthy relationship with anything that God intended for healthy use. What's happening is our brain, which usually controls how much dopamine gets dripped on a day-to-day basis, it's dumping that bucket out and just releasing all of the dopamine so that the day-to-day things no longer have an appeal. Because why would I only want a couple drops of dopamine when I know how to dump the whole bucket out? And I know how to feel better from what doesn't feel okay. So this is a process, and it needs to be grieved. There's some scripture references up there that have to do with addiction. And I think that's all I got. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you, Dani. Sorry, I had to go around. Yeah, we're out of time for questions for right now, but we will have more time for questions later.
I'll be around.
So, please continue to submit your questions, and as I was watching them come in, a lot of them had to do with stuff that you were then covering. So I think we answered some of them, but okay, yes, we will get back to your questions. Right now we're gonna move into a time of response, and so we're gonna have Diane. She's gonna come up and share her own story about her experience with addictions and faith, and then we're gonna go into a time of musical worship, which if you're not a Christian or you're not used to worshiping with music, this is a time that you can bring whatever you're feeling and whatever you've experienced to God. You don't have to fix it first or figure it out first. We can just reflect. We can sing. Feel free. You're welcome to sit or stand. You can also go to the prayer room if you feel more comfortable being in your own space. So please use this time for whatever response you need. If you are near someone or a friend, you can also pray together right here. That's fine too. So please use that time for whatever you need right now, as these topics bring up a lot for us. So I'm going to have Diane come on up, and she's going to share.
So, I'm Diane Dahlman. I am a recovered alcoholic. Is this on?
Yeah.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Hold it close. Hold it close.
Speak into the mic. Okay, I got it. Okay, I'm a recovered alcoholic, and I was in recovery and working on it for 25 years. And I'm 76 today, so that means I was 50 years old when I finally got it. So the first time a counselor told me that I should take a look at my drinking behavior, my daughter was 7 years old. When I finally surrendered through treatments, etc., trying on my own, doing everything on my own in my own power, she was 18 years old. So it was 11 years of in and out of trying. So what did I ask myself when I finally wanted to be well? Do I want to be a victim or a victor? So growing up in a proud German Catholic family, experiencing childhood sexual trauma by a neighbor, reaching out to church for help and receiving none, this describes some of what impacted my childhood. So skewed thinking kind of deconstructed my self-worth and my faith during those years. I was in my 20s, in the 70s, and introduced to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I thought then that that was a little slice of heaven on earth. So amphetamines and cocaine were my drugs of choice. The uppers let me drink longer and got me through hangovers. It was a really good pattern that worked. Through my experience of addictions, I became aware of the realities of the spiritual realm and how the enemy of my soul exploits our desires. It exploited my behaviors to destroy me. My addictions became more powerful than me, controlling me, making me a kind of victim, and I couldn't change or save myself. Achieving sobriety on my own power was elusive through years of trying, lying, manipulating, and breaking promises to my children, looking for relief from a bottle, but soon falling back into a prison of despair, always seeking more relief, and it was so temporary. This was my life until I finally surrendered on my knees, asking God for help. I finally wanted to stop hurting the people I love. This was my first unselfish prayer that I ever made in those 11 years to God. And I'm so grateful He gave me that strength to open my eyes. So how did I get from cocaine to Christ? And why did it take me so long? Humility. I was simply not a humble person. I was self-serving, arrogant, all-knowing, independent, impatient, resentful, judgmental, blameful, critical, self-pitying, and so much more than that. All those things and more kept me from being a mature adult. Yes, at the age of 50, I had the emotional maturity of a spoiled little girl, and I had to, put it plainly, I had to just grow up. My goal was to learn how to become mature in my emotions and spiritual disciplines. So how did I start learning how to be humble, thinking of others rather than myself? And the first thing is I had to be willing. I had to be willing to make a change in my life. Whatever wasn't working needed to be changed, and that was pretty much everything. Jesus asked the broken individual, do you want to be healed? And we all know what he says if we've heard the story. So I had to want it. I had to want to be willing to change so I could heal. And there was a start to becoming a victor over my battle for freedom. So the second thing I had to do was practice, just like doing anything new. It takes practice to get better. So I did. I practiced thinking less of myself, more of others, and how to be patient, and how to be punctual, and how to be an accountable adult. I practiced intentional patience by standing in the longest line at the grocery store to prove that my world didn't fall apart because I had to wait a little while. And that was huge for me. I allowed more time to be punctual, focusing on how respectful that is to others, rather than the world always waiting for the great Diane, you know. My family called me the late Diane Schmidt because I was always late. And that's what they got used to and they accepted. This was a great ego-crushing humility experience, thinking about other people. I taught myself how to say no when I could not do something for someone, rather than say yes just to make everybody feel good and like me, and then not do it and then deal with the fallout. I did a lot of that. I practiced forgiveness through prayer for the people who hurt me. By doing this, I can reduce the hate in my heart and fill it with love. And I learned that hate and love do not reside well together in my heart. Third, I had to deal with a huge amount of internal resentment. A definition for resentment is feeling of anger or displeasure about someone or something unfair, whether real or imagined. And have I ever used something I imagined happened so I could give myself a drink or a drug? I added to that definition, refusing to accept what has already been done. What has been done has been done. Since I added Bible study to my spiritual disciplines, I learned throughout the Old and New Testament, resentment is never painted in a good light. I used feelings of being treated unfairly to justify my addiction, and it worked for a long time for me. I simply removed the word blame from my vocabulary toward others and toward myself. This way I could focus on my part in the problem, no matter how small. And then I could look at the solution and not the blame. I cannot change others, only myself. That's a big AA message. Focus on what I can do to stop being judgmental and beating myself up. God doesn't want me to do that. So give it to God. It's a tiny phrase I learned, but a big part of life-saving, contentment, and peace. As I practiced thinking less of myself and more of others, I grew in humility. My heart was changing, my beliefs were changing, and my life was changing. One moment at a time. Through the power of God, I was becoming a victor in breaking chains. I no longer treated myself like a victim, feeling sorry for myself, full of self-pity. I was not that person anymore. Today, I have hope for experiencing heaven outside of a bottle or a drug, and that's a wonderful feeling. Today, I am enough. I am worth something, and that I am worth something in God's eyes, and that's what helped me build me. All because I was willing to make a choice each day to walk the path of Jesus, and not perfectly, but always knowing that the path is there. A choice each day to be humble in my relationships, making me a better friend, a better mother, a better grandmother, and wife. And the first and most important relationship was that with my Lord and Savior, Jesus. Thank you so much for your time.
And have 4 children ranging in ages from 6th grade to 20-somethings. He is the author of 3 books, the latest of which is Substance Becoming Oaks of Righteousness in a World of Vapor. And this is not in his bio, but I will personally say that if you check out Substance, the book, there is a lot of these dynamics within that book where he talks about the origin and slavery of addictions, basically of idolatry. So it is a really relevant book for this topic as well. So thanks, Nick, for being here with us.
Yeah, there's 2 chapters in Substance on slavery and liberty as part of sanctification and Christian growth right from here. And so you might find that helpful. Okay. Can you jump forward to number 1? I'm going to dive right in. I have a lot of words for you, and I'm going to say 4 things about how Christian faith integrates very directly with questions about addiction. When I say addiction, I am mostly going to mean addiction small a. So sometimes in my office as a pastor, we talk about abuse small a and abuse big A. Abuse small a is any sin. Any sin is the misuse of another image-bearing person that God created and is the object of his divine love. It is the misuse of that person, i.e. it's the abuse of them. But we're not going to call the police. We're going to repent and believe and seek reconciliation, so on. It's abuse small a. Abuse big A is, it's a sin, we're going to repent and believe, and I might have to call the police, right? And because the word abuse gets thrown around, right? You have to kind of be precise about what you mean. Because we live in a therapeutic culture and we live in like I don't know how I would characterize this. We say a lot of words that are doing a lot more work than they can, and we leave really false impressions on people with our imprecision, right? And so the words abuse and addiction. So I will be mainly meaning addiction small a, and by that I mean us compulsively doing things we wish we could stop that we know aren't good for us in the long run, and that we know aren't serving us and God's purposes for our lives. And that can be like eating too much sugar, watching TV too late at night, you just can't seem to stop doing that, and then it screws up your next day, right? Like there's all these like behaviors that we just know aren't good for us. And we just do them, and we're seeking some kind of comfort. We're getting something out of it, just like when somebody smokes crack cocaine. But it's not chronic to the level, because remember, when we say mental health issue, somebody's mentally ill, we don't mean there's something wrong in their mind. That's not what mental illness means. Mental illness means, on a clinical level, somebody's dysfunction is making it so they can't live a normal life. Their life has become so dysfunctional they can't continue, and they need help to get back to where they can function. It's a functional definition most of the time. Now sometimes it's like a medical sort of thing where saying you have this sort of condition, and you can kind of put your finger on it medically, like bipolar 1, for example. It's like a very inborn, very bodily, biological mental disorder. But depression, we just say depression. There's like 50 depressions, right? There's a lot of different dynamics. So Stanton Jones, when he went to study sexuality and depression at University of Arizona, he studied with a woman who, I can't think, Kathleen something, I think her name, she was an expert on depression. And he was studying sexuality in the same department, but what they were finding with depression was, we would say depression, but the phenomenon of depression had so many reasons why it happened, on so many different kinds of levels, it functioned in so many different ways in different people, and was cured in so many different ways in different people. They were like, okay, we have this like catch-all we call depression, but there are like maybe dozens of depressions, right? In his sexual research about even homosexuality, he said, even same-sex attraction or same-sex sexual function, we call it all homosexuality, but there's probably 10 or 12 different homosexualities. Does that make sense? And that's probably true for a lot of these catch-all psychological areas, where we're trying to group a bunch of phenomena that are similar together, and addiction is like that. There's a lot of compulsive behavior among human beings, right? And so on one edge of the spectrum, we have addiction, small a. I'm doing stuff I know is bad for me. I wish I could stop. There is a better that I can't make myself do. I'm having trouble doing what I know I would be best for me, right? And I'm getting something out of it, and crap, right? 2, what you might call chronic addiction. So I'll say chronic addiction when I mean addiction, big A, which is often, there's a strong bodily component, there's a long, like, you've cut a long groove in what Kevin called like that path you make in the, right? So you've wired your brain around this, and like the biological components of it have been exacerbated more, and so on. Does that make sense? I'm not particularly a believer in that there's an addiction gene, but I do think our genetics dispose our personality in various ways that create a cocktail that is more or less likely to get addicted to things, right? So for example, highly impulsive personalities statistically are more likely to get addicted, right? There's some personalities where like doing a substance just kind of does more for you, it just feels better. Some people, they'll take a substance, they'll be like, I don't like the way that feels, right? So like more adventurous, higher in openness personalities, they are more likely to get addicted. They're more likely to try drugs, and more likely to get addicted to drugs. Does that make sense? So I'm not like, there's an addiction gene generally, but our genetic makeup disposes us in lots of different ways. And if you put together impulsivity with high in openness, with blah, 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 those different profiles can be genetically prone. Does that make sense? To addiction, right? So we're all dealing with this in slightly different ways. Okay, so I want to say 4 things about Christian faith and addiction. The first is that Jesus' way is not simplistic, but his invitation is simple. Okay, his way around the human condition, what's wrong with us and what can go right with us, particularly in our compulsive behaviors, is not simplistic, but it is simple. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, Joe. I believe that most human beings, okay, this might be offensive, most human beings just aren't that smart, okay? And they're not that educated, and they don't expend the energy to think that clearly. When you put that stuff together, most of us think in very simplistic axioms that just kind of work for us. Okay, we call those heuristics, like mental shortcuts, okay? And when it comes to something like addiction, especially something like addiction, because addiction really threatens us personally, and so whenever something threatens us, on top of that, we want a pretty simple way to think about it that like lays it out for us. Now, on the religious side of that being overly simplistic, sometimes you get the legalistic metaphor, which is, hey, like you made this choice, you got yourself into this, you need to get yourself out of it. My job here is accountability, okay? Like, straight up and flat right. Does that make sense? Now, to a certain extent, that's true. From a wider perspective, it's stupid, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, on one level, you're like, nobody put your gun to your head the first time you took that drug. right? But it's kind of like, yeah, but like, if you understand the human person more capaciously, like what was going on and what they came through and why that situation was there, well, like, come on. Like, we need to help, right? Okay, on the therapeutic side, it's like addiction is disease, right? Now, when you say addiction is a disease, remember that from like A Star is Born? When, what's his name, handsome guy was like, I can't believe I'm drinking again, I gotta go to rehab. She's like, it's a disease, you don't even have to apologize, right? Remember that? Okay, addiction is a disease. Okay, here's the problem then. It's not even a simile, addiction is like a disease. We use the full metaphor, addiction is a disease. Now that's a very imprecise way to talk, right? If I said, have you ever seen Jill run? Jill is the wind, right? Like, everybody, if I say that, everybody knows that Jill is like the wind in some ways and not like the wind in other ways, right? If you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know Jill was immaterial. Like, nobody would say that. You know, it's like, she seems to just like effortlessly just glide along as though nothing was holding her back and she's just filled with like exuding energy. Does that make sense? Addiction is a disease in that it has some components that are similar to diseases. But it's also highly dissimilar to a disease. Did you remember that? The video that Kevin showed was just fabulous, right? You get all this stuff about how it affects the brain and blah, 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 and then you get to the very end and you get the little advocacy sentence. Please help us to treat addiction like the disease that it is. As though she wanted to say at the end, after giving us all this helpful information we could use in part, that this was the whole thing without remainder. Right? It's just a disease, therefore all it requires is a medicalized approach. Okay, listen, friends, Christians cannot accept that. We do not accept that. We do, and philosophy doesn't accept that. That is such a ridiculous philosophy of mind. It's like the belief that there's no such thing as consciousness. Right? Do you remember Kevin's quote? I believe that the mind, he didn't say the brain. He said what exudes from or supervening in the thing we call consciousness, the human mind, is powerful. Right? And it can overcome things. We are not, the mind is not just affected by the brain. Consciousness can affect the brain and the body and guide it. That's what is different about us than many of the animals that we anthropomorphize in our house that we call pets, right? Now, because of that, we tend to use very simplistic things, but Jesus doesn't. One example, let's go to the next slide, is if you look at Jesus' ministry of healing, okay? So, Jesus is the Son of God. We believe as Christians that he has the potency of God in him. But very rarely are his miracles like big God miracles. Like, for example, there's one place where they're going across the Sea of Galilee and there's the big storm, right? And they all think they're going to die. And he just tells the weather to shut up, right? He's like, be still. And the whole thing is still. And the disciples are like, oh my gosh, like, who is this guy that the wind and the waves obey him, right? Because he was, in that moment, he was showing that all the fear that could come into your life, at bottom, the fact that he is God is what calms everything. Does that make sense? Now, here's the thing though. That's not the only one he did that. Like, almost all of the rest of the miracles of Jesus follow a very specific 6-band system on miracles. It's the same 6 miracles over and over and over again. It's blindness, deafness, disability, or lameness, or being crippled is the old word for that, right? Uncleanness, skin diseases where you couldn't be around anybody, demonization, that's the most. And then 5th is raising people from the dead. Jesus raised 3 people from the dead, right? Now, when you look at that, and you go, well, why? If he can stop storms, why is it this 6 over and over and over and over again? And the reason is because miracles are signs. These miracles are the semiotics, or the signs, or the display of the purposes of God towards human being that he was trying to show us. He's showing us how, by people he's miraculously healing, what is actually wrong with the human race. This is what we need. And by doing so, see, he'd heal a blind person, he'd say, and then he'd give a teaching. He's like, you see, you won't believe it. You're blind. Or he'd heal somebody from deafness, and he's like, he'd say something that was hard to believe in, but true. And he'd say, he who has ears to hear, let them hear it. Does that make sense? Or, you know, or he all the way through this, or he'd like raise somebody up. Now, what Jesus is trying to show people is this. The human race has a very multifaceted malady. Sin is not just choice is to sin. There's a way in which we are all part of a human race that intergenerationally, all across the dynamics of our human function, are being affected by these 6 ways that are killing us. They are damning us. They are destroying us. Does that make sense? And so what he's saying is, if I'm going to heal you spiritually through faith, something has to happen in you spiritually that follows the semiotics or the signs I'm showing in the physical miraculous healings that I'm doing. You have to see what you're blind to. And because you're blind and you can't see it, you actually need somebody to tell you the truth, and you have to believe them when they tell you. You have to not be deaf. You have to be able to, you have to have ears to hear. And you see, if you don't do that, it will just diminish you as a human being. You won't be able to do the function of what you were meant to do, and it'll destroy you on the inside. You'll lose all your hope. Remember the pool of Bethesda where Jesus is like, do you want to get better? And the guy's like, look, every time the angel stirs the water, I just can't get over there. There's like, I can't, like, it's over, dude. Like, I'm done. And he's like, I asked you, do you want to get better? Right? He said, I didn't. A doctor comes for sick people. The problem of you being sick is not the problem. The problem is that you're sick and you will not admit you need help. So he comes to the person who is crippled. Right? I know I don't like those words, but Jesus is intentionally making an evocative metaphor. You are like the man lying behind a pool that can't get up. You cannot help yourself. You cannot heal yourself. Right? And yet you want to complain about it when somebody says you're ready to be healed. Are you willing to get up? I mean, how many people have you tried to help in your life? How many times people have tried to help you? How many times have you tried to help yourself? And you just have to get up at the word of something outside of your immediate feelings. You have to pry yourself out of that bed. You have to get up and do the thing that you know is good for you. I can't tell you how many times I've laid around, like, sick with the flu or something. I know I have to get up and get something to drink. Or I'm not going to be better tomorrow. But I just want to lay there. I just want Lexi to know I need it and to come upstairs and give it to me and tend to me all day long. But I have to get up and go do it. I've been camping before where I'm just cold at night. But I know if I get out of my sleeping bag, I'm going to be a lot colder for about 5 minutes. But to get out of my sleeping bag and to go and get more stuff to put on me to get warm, I have to be colder before I'm warmer. Right? I have to get up when you're called to get up. And you see how as you work through these, and then when you get to uncleanness, right? This is collateralization, right? Why do we confront people who are addicted? Because they're killing us. Right? I can see Linda Seaman in my mind. Like, all the times she came down to my office when I was in Panama City, Florida, saying, my son broke into our garage again, stole everything, and sold it for pennies on the dollar to get more meth. Right? Like part of it is, the reason why uncleanness is one of them is because Jesus is saying, there's this dynamic where you hurt other people. There's a sanitation problem. Like, we are really offended at the idea of, like, anybody being unclean. God is not at all ashamed of saying that. You are an infection to the people around you. You are bringing disease into their life. You are harming them profoundly. And you should have to stay outside of the camp yelling unclean until you're miraculously healed so you can come back in. That's the way it should work. You don't have the right to collateralize all of your problems on everybody else in your life. But I'll heal you. I will make you clean. Right? And so on. And demonization is, of course, maybe the worst version of this. And the closest, people say Jesus was he wasn't that sophisticated. He was a first century Jew. This is probably just him healing mental illness. Okay, but get more specific. Demonization is the superlative version of a different spirit of compulsion to your own destruction possessing you. Right? Now, what mental illness is that? Right? It's much closer to chronic addiction than schizophrenia. And therefore, much easier for us to identify with. Though I hear plenty of voices, like I can identify with the things that I do compulsively getting more and more ground in my life until it's like a spirit possessing me and dragging me to my own doom. Does that make sense? And ultimately, all these things are going to kill us. All right, let's go to the next one. Now, if you think of it that way, that these 6 things are blindness points to delusion, deafness to self-justification, lameness to inability to do what we were meant to do, to fulfill our purpose and calling, uncleanness to collaterality, us hurting other people. To be enslaved in demonization is that we're dominated by a spirit that is not ourselves, and death is our own final self-destruction. Who does that remind you of? Right? Now, obviously, we're here talking about a specific thing. But that reminds me of this chronic addiction. A chronically addicted person who's not in recovery, right? They're blind. They can't see it. They won't listen to anybody, right? They can't do the stuff in their life that would make their life purposeful and meaningful and helpful to others, right? They're hurting other people around them. It's like a spirit has possessed them, and they're less and less themselves, and they're going to kill themselves. Now, here's what Jesus is also saying. That is every single member of the human race. The difference between us is not in kind. The difference between us is in amount, and how much that it has taken over in us, and how much we're being delivered, right? And so what Jesus is trying to help all of the human race see is that he is seeking to save us from addiction, right? In some ways, that is the overarching metaphor of salvation, because damnation is, in a sense, the loss of your divine image-bearing capacity as a human person, to being reduced to something where the thing that is so valuable in you for God to redeem, there's nothing left of it. It's all burned out. All that's left is itch, reaction, compulsion. There's no humanity left anymore, right? That was at least the Anglophiles philosophizing of people like Dorothy Sayers and J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and some of the poets of that time. Because of that, we should all be able to really identify with addiction. We probably all can identify with addiction, small a. And we should all on some level be able to see a condition in us flowing to just a deeper tragedy in others to where it's overwhelming them. And when you know how many times you've fallen for your own small a addictions, to turn around and treat somebody else like they're a pariah because they've been overwhelmed by their chronic addiction is hypocrisy. Does that make sense? Even though you could be morally serious with them because you're still being morally serious with yourself. Go to the last slide of this section. And so here's the thing. Even though Jesus sees us in this, I think, helpfully complex way, and is trying to show us the depth of our problems, his invitation to us is actually relatively simple. It's just an invitation to him, right? He's simple enough in and of himself. I love you, come to me. But he's infinitely complex as you get to know him, right? And so his invitation can be really simple. Just come to me. Are you broken? Are you needy? Are you lost? Like, listen, I'm going to put my yoke on you. Like, you're going to follow me. This is going to be a real thing. But you'll be mine. Walk with me. I'm telling you, you'll find rest for your soul. You'll find it will fit. You'll find it will work. Just come with me. And I can't tell you everything we're going to walk through, but you'll be with me the whole time, right? That invitation is really quite simple. And that's all we have to do with ourselves and our addictions, or with other people who are in chronic addiction. Be like, look, Jesus isn't done with you. He doesn't hate you. But he is inviting you to come with him in the best way you can at this moment. Maybe that's repentance. Maybe that's hearing what he has to tell you in spite of the blindness of our delusion. Maybe he's trying to do something functional right now. Like, what is it? It's something, and I can do it with you. Okay, let's go to the next one. The second thing is nothing. Sorry for that word. That Jesus offers us the paradox of amnesty with agency. Okay, here's the paradox of the disease model without limiting principles. Okay, there's truths in the disease model, but without limiting principles, it's a monstrosity and a heresy. Okay, and here's why. Because if the main reason why the disease model is utilized is basically two reasons. One is there are scientific things about it that we should know that are helpful for people. We call it psychosocial or whatever education. And that can be really helpful for people. To know why you're having a certain kind of reaction, what it will feel like in your body, how to ground yourself in that. That foundationally for people can be very helpful. I work with people who have panic attacks, right? You're just like, hey, here's what's happening in your body. Put an ice cube right here. Put your feet on the ground. Breathe this way, right? That can be very helpful, okay? The second reason, though, is mainly because, particularly within social work, we have a very strong anti-stigmatization mentality. We don't want anybody to feel bad. Shame is a categorically bad category. It's always maladaptive. It's always non-productive, okay? Brene Brown is a millionaire for saying that in a relatively eloquent way, okay? She's completely wrong, okay? You are supposed to feel bad. Now, the way the Apostle Paul said this in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 is he distinguished between godly sorrow and worldly sorrow. Okay? The kind of shame that breaks us down and demotivates us is actually a form of self-pity. It's not actually morally grounded shame. It comes from a person that's not really morally grounded. They don't see a greater moral vision outside of them in the person of God and what they really are in creation. They see things happening to them. They see people not liking them. They see the results that are going to happen and what they're not going to have. They see themselves in relationship to themselves in an idolatrous and self-pitying way they feel like garbage. And they'll punish themselves. And it says that godly sorrow leads to death. It is unproductive shame. There definitely is unproductive shame. It's in the church, it's in people all over the place, and identifying it is incredibly important. Because where there's unproductive shame, you are not going to make any progress. Okay, here's the problem. Without productive shame, you are also not going to make any progress. There is a productive feel bad. I mean, think about this. People used to say in AA, and I'm not a huge AA fan, but there's some good principles there, right? And people used to say, you can't help anybody until they've hit rock bottom, right? Well, what the heck is rock bottom? For who? Right? You see, back in the 1930s, when you had a generally Judeo-Christian set of assumptions about people who were alcoholics knew they weren't living up to these like basic moral principles, and they'd taken them in with their mother's milk. They felt like they were relatively objective. They probably even thought there was a God. And so when they were wrecking their lives, they really felt objectively morally mad about it. And they were like, I can't be this person. There was a residual formation of moral groundedness in people. And so they would hit a moral rock bottom for them. Does that make sense? We have a generation now that believes in subjective moral. There's no moral absolutes. There's no you have to be anything. Everything's subjective. So what is their bottom? And the answer is, increasingly, death. Right? Like, what is your rock bottom? And the answer is your death. Like in fishing we say, look, we love rock bottoms, we hate silt bottoms. Right? Silt bottoms don't hold any fish. There's no structure. There's nothing hard there. You can't stand on it. You know what I mean? You stand on a silt bottom, you just sink in. You see, the problem is that we're waiting for a lot of people to hit rock bottom, and they don't have rock bottoms, they have silt bottoms morally. They don't go, how can I ignore my kid? I cannot be this person. Like, there isn't enough moral groundedness in them. Now, here's the problem. If you dump a bunch of worldly sorrow on them, right? I don't like you, I'm your counselor, I'm your pastor, you're a terrible person. Like, even though I'm trying to give it spiritually, it just could produce worldly sorrow, which won't be productive. Okay, go to the next slide. One of the ways in which Christian counseling has resources that non-Christian counseling literally can't have is because the fundamental dynamic of forgiveness is not self-forgiveness. It is atonement. It is someone died in your place. That is, the punishment you deserve was put on another. You don't have the right to forgive yourself. You don't have that right. You didn't sin. I mean, you can forgive yourself to the extent to which you have a claim to punish yourself. Does that make sense? If you're punishing yourself and you say, look, I'm not going to punish myself. I'm going to forgive myself. Well, you can do that because that's your authority. But the damnation of God, you don't have the right to do that. Or the reprobation of others. You can't even make them forgive you. Forgive yourself on their behalf. If I've sinned against Jill, I can't forgive myself for Jill forgiving me. Does that make sense? Right? Now, I cannot cradle her resentment expressed towards me, but I can't control her forgiveness of me. You see, what the cross allows, the cross of Jesus allows, is two things. One, it can help people find their moral gravity. If you think about the way the cross started in the Old Testament, there were the Israelites kept complaining against God, and so God sent poisonous snakes to bite and kill them. Right? People were getting bitten, they were just dying. And they cried out to God for help because the only person who can save you from God is God. And God said, okay, here's what you do. Take a snake, you make a bronze snake that looks like the snakes that are killing everybody. You put it on a pole and you lift it up. And anybody who's bitten by the snake can look at that pole. And if all they have to do is look at the bronze snake, and they won't die from the poison. Right? You're like, well, that's an interesting story. But you see, what repentance really is finding your moral gravity through acknowledging what you've done. Without that, you could never get better. You have to say, I did this. It was wrong. I sinned against you. I sinned against me. I sinned against God. I have leprosy. I have thrown my collaterality all over all of you. I did not listen. I would not be corrected. I broke down my own capacity. I hurt everybody else. I became possessed by a spirit that was not my own, and it was leading totally to my self-destruction, and I'm sorry. Right? And if that happens, and you're forced to, you look at the bronze snake and you say, that's right, I did that and I deserve that snake. The minute you look at it, the minute you acknowledge it, God's like, that's all I needed from you. That's what I wanted, that's all I needed. I just needed you to come to your senses. Like the prodigal son, it says he came to his senses and he started to come home. That has to happen for the salvation of every person. They have to come to their senses. And you see, the cross gives the moral grounding to that. But simultaneously, because it's the Son of Man and the Son of God on the cross, dying for our sins, right? He justifies us and dies in our place, so that anybody who will not accept our forgiveness of God does not accept the forgiving work of God himself, which is unworkable. And, like I said before, you know how I said we were all addicts, so it's kind of hypocritical to be too mad at the other addicts, right? This goes back to the story of the unforgiving servant in Matthew 20, right? The guy who, he was forgiven for $10 million, he goes chokes the guy who owes him $50, right? You see, the dynamic here is that once you realize, and you come to your own moral gravity, and you realize that you had to look at the snake and you were forgiven, then you can't turn to the next person and want to put them down. And so you see, the cross allows for is the God who is just and the one who justifies, who is both the lion and the lamb, the one who can force us to face and acknowledge what's wrong with us, what we are, what we're doing, that we need these 6 miracles, so that we find our moral gravity and we start to become a person again. That's the moment. See, when you find your moral gravity, it's when you start to become a human being again. When your cogitative and emotional life isn't being pulled down into your sensuality and your addiction, but you're actually moving beyond your cogitative capacity into a moral and spiritual capacity. You're becoming in the image of God again. You're moving into those faculties and having the possibility through faith to have them renewed. It's choosing your humanity. It's choosing God rather than your own damnation and destruction. At that moment, that turn that only you can make, right? We're saved on the condition of faith. That's all God needs for you, and all the rest he does. And one of the main things he does is he heals your leprosy. He makes you clean. He justifies you before other sinners who are also justified, so that we can be a beloved community even before we're better. Right? We can love each other as justified people who belong to God even before we're better. And only the cross does that. Only atonement does that. And that's one reason why the resources of the church spiritually and of Christian counselors who integrate this carefully are actually profoundly psychologically superior to those of secular counselors who don't have the mechanism of atonement to appeal to. They have to use empty psychological categories that are not grounded in reality to appease the spiritual conscience of human beings by convincing them that they are not spiritual beings and those categories don't exist, so that they can be free of them. But in doing so, they are increasing the person's damnation by making them less functional in the image of God in their own psychology. And so the church needs to be combative when we have to be with psychology as a movement, but also utilize this when we care for people ourselves. Okay, I'll move on the next thing. I have no idea where we are. Okay. 3, Jesus gives deeper conceptual pictures of addiction. So when we sit down with people, you heard me say before that part of the dynamic of helping people is like saying something that helps them, where they're like, I get that helps me, okay? I remember reading somewhere that in talk therapy, the biggest indicator that somebody would actually like do better is that they had good rapport with the counselor. No training, not anything the counselor knew, not whether it was CBT or DBT or whatever, it was just like, they just have a good rapport with the counselor. Like, why is that? Well, it can be that counselors, like pastors, are just averagely smart people. We can't be infinitely complex. And so, like, you know, we have a hammer, a screwdriver, everything looks like a screw and a nail to us, right? Like, and so some of it is just like, you just have to keep changing counselors until like, the thing they see is the thing you have. And then it clicks. But sometimes it's just kind of like, they can say it in a way that helps you. That's it. Right? Like I've sat down with people and I've like explained something to them and I thought it was really, really good. You know, I was like, I broke it all out conceptually. There was 74 layers, whatever. And it was just like, and then somebody was like, you gotta put this down and let it go. And you gotta turn to God. And the person just like burst into tears. Oh my God. That's what I have to do. You know? And I'm like, I'm useless. You know? And it's like, but there are some people that I sit down with and they're like, Nick, I've talked to 50 counselors. They're a bunch of idiots. Like, I don't know what they think they're doing, right? And I sit down and I do the whole like Nick thing with them. They're like, oh my gosh, this is so helpful. And their marriage gets better. And it's like, what's going on, right? And the answer is that no, not everybody's for everybody. But one of the ways Jesus helps us is he actually gives us lots of different pictures. Lots of different things to apply and think through in a certain kind of way, right? So go to the next one if you would. So I'll give you 3 really quickly. The first is the concept of infirmity or weakness, okay? What I would argue is, like, if you're like an Oaks volunteer or something like that, infirmity, I think, is a more helpful word than disease, okay? Again, I'm not trying to, like, whip big boy, like the disease model, there's some good stuff in it, okay? But there's a lot more, and the more we use the word disease, the more it tends to push out the other stuff and create an equivocation fallacy on whether or not we're morally responsible. I'm sorry if that didn't make sense to you, but that's what I mean. Now, infirmity is just like you are in a state of weakness and inability. Now, there can be a lot of reasons for that. One is something that, like, is it your fault? Like, you got a disease, literally a disease, right? It could be that, like, you contributed partially. It could be that it's all your fault, right? Like, there's one guy who's paralyzed in the Bible that Jesus heals, and then later he runs into Jesus, and Jesus says, like, stop sinning or something worse is going to happen to you. And a lot of people have speculated the reason Jesus says that is because he was paralyzed because he had gotten syphilis. And that since he had been healed, he'd already gone to a prostitute, and Jesus knew it. And he was like, dude, you need to quit with the prostitutes, right? Now, so there's a whole spectrum of why we're weak. And there's like at least 6 different theories about addiction that are all kind of intermingled with each other. But at the end of the day, we're not able to stop ourselves from doing something. It's an infirmity. And I think that the word infirmity is a more helpful descriptor than disease in most cases. Especially if you're not dealing with somebody with chronic addiction. If you have somebody with very chronic addiction, particularly to a very addictive substance, like crack cocaine, let's say, right, and so on, family history and all that kind of stuff, then like sometimes that disease model is real helpful. There are a few sins in my life that I have addictive tendencies towards that I treat like it's a disease, right? Like I treat sexual addiction, gateways, like a disease. Like the kind of stuff I do to keep myself away from pornography. I don't have a pornography problem. But there's something about that whole like affirmation of women that's like catnip for me for some wound I still carry that I haven't fixed yet. And I just know like that thing needs to be like locked down, like I could get cancer at any moment, okay? There's other stuff that it's just like, I gotta be careful, but it's not the same thing. Does that make sense? Okay. With infirmity, what it does is, infirmity does not assume destigmatization without conviction, right? You can be very destigmatizing to not produce worldly sorrow in how you talk about infirmity, but it still leaves open linguistically, like the conceptualization, like, yeah, this is my responsibility. Like, because here's one of the reasons why I bang on the disease thing is, if you say you have a disease that needs treatment, like it's like cancer, right? The question is, okay, well, does that mean I couldn't have done anything? It's like, well, it's not your fault. It's like, okay, but I could have done something. It's like, well, maybe you could have done something, but it's not your fault. It's like, you see, if you really destigmatize something because something's really not somebody's fault, you're also saying implicitly and deductively that they don't have agency or responsibility. You see, that's a terrible dilemma. You have to destigmatize something, but also retain human responsibility and agency. And you see, if you start with just infirmity, like this is a weakness, you don't necessarily have to mete out whose fault it is. You have to say, look, this may be totally your fault. That's just not what we're working on right now. Right? A citing plan isn't what we're doing. Okay? And see, if somebody's a Christian, you go right to the cross. You say, look, Jesus died so we wouldn't waste our energy on this. Do you believe that Jesus died for your sins? Yes. Do you believe that you have sinned in lots of ways? Yes. Do you believe there's probably some sins in this? Well, yeah. Okay, great. Well, you're justified by faith in Jesus the Christ who died for your sins. God died for you. Like, we don't have to worry about this. Now let's move on, right? Directing people to their justification within a Christian context is extraordinarily helpful because now you don't have to bend over backwards to lie to them to destigmatize their lives, right? A forgiven person has more peace than a person we've helped be in denial about their guilt. And you can't help them because here's the problem, friends. God designed the human conscience so that it can't not know that it's guilty. Okay? Your conscience, you can do all the wires out you can think of, and your conscience at a certain level will still know you're guilty. If you try to bypass that with like just a waving of the hand, like, oh, it's no big deal, or like, you're not at fault at all, or whatever, without going to the heart of the death of the Son of God, not only are we throwing away the resources of literally the cross itself, but we're also doing something that can never really work. Does that make sense? Because our job is to take demoralized people and moralize them. Right? Okay, let's go to the next one. I've said a bunch on that. Okay, the second is slavery. In the Bible, slavery is directly related to sin. Jesus explicitly says in John 8, right? Is it John 8? John 8, yeah. He says, listen, everybody who sins is a slave to sin. You are, right? Why? Well, because sin is by definition addiction. It is a short-term mechanism
by which you try to deal with a problem that you think that you have in a way that you think you need to solve it, in a way that you know isn't right. This is literally the definition of addiction. So all sin is enslaving. And everybody who sins is a slave to sin. And so therefore, one of the mysteries of Jesus is liberation. It has to be, because sin is addiction, right? Now, and additionally, there's also a good metaphor in the Exodus about how we fall into addictions. Because when the Israelites go to Egypt, are they doing a bad thing? No, they're just escaping a famine, and Joseph has this great position, and they're honored, and then things just kind of change, and before they know it, they're stuck. And they're enslaved, and things get worse, and they're dying. And they have to cry out to God, and they need a miracle. Does that make sense? And so even in the story of the Exodus, it's not their fault. It's not Israel's fault, right? Maybe they should have left and got in the promised land earlier than that. I don't know, but even sometimes something we do because we think it's right, other circumstances happen and we find ourselves enslaved. And then when we come out of slavery, even through a miracle, it's not easy. And we're not the kind of person prepared for success. Right? That generation of slaves in Egypt, they all died in the desert. None of them were able to step up to what it really took. They were grumbling, complaining, self-interested, self-pitying. And God had to raise a whole other group of people. A trip that should have taken 2 weeks took 40 years. Because he had to raise a whole other group of people who had a completely different attitude, who had forged themselves in the hardships of the desert. Those were the people ready to enter the promised land. Does that make sense? Okay. So, and ironically, therefore, being captivated by Jesus brings true freedom from real slavery. Now listen, there's lots of people who are oppressed, and slavery is exerted, or oppression is exerted from them on the outside. And that's something publicly, in terms of social justice, we should do things about where we can identify and do something. But every person, oppressed or unoppressed, privileged or underprivileged, all of us are subject to the human condition, which falls under those 6 things that Jesus came to heal. Does that make sense? And all of us, therefore, need to be captivated of heart by Jesus so that we can be freed from the addiction of sin. Okay, let's go to the last of the 3. And that's idolatry, or a false salvation. The substance, the behavior, the whatever, the biblical concept for that is idolatry. Right? An idol is a thing that we go to for a salvation that isn't God, and it was never meant to produce that for us. It's deaf and dumb and deceptive, right? And as we pursue it, we become worse. We are made in the image of the idol, especially if it's evil, and we end up broken. We don't get what we need, and we actually can't find what we were meant to have. And when the thing is a good thing, we destroy that thing, right? And so, a couple things to think about relative to this is, one, like if you think like Gabriel Monroe would say something like, to understand why the addiction, ask why the hurt, or what's the hurt. And let's deal with the trauma, and then we'll understand the addiction a lot better. That's really good. That's okay. A broader, more spiritual way to say that, Christianly, is what's the human need, desire, craving that needs salvation, that is reaching out desperately for the good life, to be redeemed or rescued, right? Like unreligious, your word salvation, some of the religious words, because they all have secular meanings, right? Salvation is just to be rescued, right? So I'm in a state from which I need to be rescued, salvation, and I'm turning to an object that will rescue me. That's the God, small g. It's either Yahweh, the God, right? Or it's an idol. Does that make sense? And if you can recognize what that idol is, you can say, okay, that's not going to do it. And to think of it in terms of idolatry puts it in a religious category that adds to the other categories of, it's not good for me in terms of my health or hygiene and so on. We want to keep moving up. I mean, to use a crass psychological example, right? Do you remember for years ago there was the Maslow hierarchy of needs? It started with do I have food, right? And it was self-actualization, whatever that means, right? And it's you kind of work your way up, right? And when you're dealing with somebody, you want to get as many levels as you can in terms of human experience, knowledge, function, and so on. Does that make sense? From hey, we're gonna eat, right? And I care about you, and to who is God and who are you and what were you meant to be, right? Not only do we see younger people, younger generations dealing with a relational vacuum and some of the highest levels of loneliness we've ever seen, but we also see a profound meaning vacuum. Like a lot of young people are real self-righteous about leaving churches. I'm a nun, I'm a, right? And it's like, okay, great. Who are you in this spinning universe? And the answer is, they have no idea. There's no mythos, there's no bigger story that they're a part of. And their own brain, to use the brain language, is wired for story. This is one of the reasons why I tell, okay, this is a little bit of a hot take, but I usually tell psychologists, I'm like, look, use as little psychological language with your clients as you possibly can. It's unhelpful. They just use it against each other. They go home, you have marriage therapy, you tell them about spirals, this and this triggers that, and this, like, whatever, and they just go home and yell that at each other instead of spiritual stuff when they were fundamentalist Christians. Right? Like, in religious language, it's the same way. You can go to theology class, learn a bunch of theology, and you can throw those theology words at each other, and you can go to Bible studies class, and you can learn a bunch of verses, and you can fling those verses at each other, okay? I have about as many, when I do marriage counseling, I have about as many people flinging verses at each other as psychological terms at each other. But listen, I've heard some wingers, some people who've been to like 5 years of marriage counseling, and they're winging the technical psychological jargon at each other, and you're like, you guys, you don't even know what those words mean. And they're like, yes, we do, and I'm like, and this is why I always tell psychologists and theologians, sophistication in your office is superstition on the street. Like, you think you know what that word means, but you didn't even learn what that word really meant in grad school, and you've forgotten most of it now, and when you tell it to your client, they get it's a little snippet, and then it means whatever self-righteously justifies them in an argument they want it to mean, and then that's how they use it with their spouse or whoever, right? And I'm not just being a psychologist, right? That's true for theology words and Bible studies and verses and all of that. People are self-justifying critters. Remember Diane's thing? She wasn't like, you know what I need was more compassion. She was like, no, I woke up and I found out I was a selfish jerk. Everything was about me and I was self-pitying. Like, the moment she found her moral gravity, that had to happen. And then she also needed compassion too. She didn't even know that there was amnesty. There was somewhere she could go. Both have to happen, right? So, relative to idolatry, understanding idolatry is really helpful. It's also helpful when people have to go back to the thing that they were originally addicted to. How do you use the thing that was your God? And the answer is, I think C.S. Lewis's concept of first and second things is really helpful. When he's like, a first thing is, a first thing is something that is truly ultimate. And a second thing is just something that's just itself. You see, when sex becomes a God, sex is a second thing. It's just a thing. It's actually, I don't know if you know this, you guys. This is crazy. Sex is the human reproductive function. Did you know that? That it was it's in our bodies as this thing that makes other humans, it replicates human beings. Did you know that? It's because I don't think the human race knows that. I don't know if you know this, but in the current fertile generation, 47% of women will be childless. 47%. That's extinction. Do you understand? That's human extinction. Because people are like, why would I get pregnant? It's like, I want to have sex every minute, but I don't. It's like, you become completely disconnected from what this even is. Like, I get that it's fun. But like, it's fun to make you do it so that you make humans. That's literally why it's fun in your biology. Right? And so you'll stay together. That's why it's bonding. So that when you have the children, you'll stay together when you do the fun thing that makes more babies. It's literally to make babies. Like, and I'm okay with like enjoying the fun of it, but like, do you really see what happened? The enjoyment of sex became the idol. Right? The first thing in sex was, I received life from my parents. I give life to another generation. It's the fundamental purpose of my existence. It's the deepest meaning I could possibly have. It's the most grateful way I can even receive my own existence in life. I should find a suitable, useful partner and have children. When I do the thing that makes the children, I'm going to have a lot of fun, and hopefully it'll be really bonding so we can stay together, and that'll be great. Does that make sense? It's the first thing. You get those things flipped, it screws up your whole existence. And friends, this is why we need theology and moral teaching. And see, one of the reasons why Christian psychology has the possibility of an incredible competitive advantage in the psychology market is that it has the capacity to moralize in a non-abusive way, right? And so this is always my charge to Christian counselors, is like, you have to learn to integrate your theology so that you can helpfully moralize. And you will not have been taught any of this in your training if you got it in the last 25 years. Because everything in modern psychology is utterly unstigmatizing. There's no moral propositions, nothing. And you see, Christian faith can overcome that. We can just be like, well, but God has spoken, shown himself, and these are these parameters, and you can find your moral gravity, and you can find your amnesty to come back in, and he can heal these. Okay, last thing quickly, is that Jesus gives immediate help and hope, but in a developmental pathway, okay? One of the incredibly important things we have to recognize, especially if you're like a Bible-believing Christian, okay, which I am, okay, I'm doing quotes because people make fun of that, but believe that the Bible is the Word of God written, so I'm a Bible-believing Christian, right? Now, part of the issue is that sometimes we think, okay, I'm going to open my Bible, I'm going to read you the verse, I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're just going to do it, right? Or I'm a charismatic. I'm going to pray that the Holy Spirit would come upon you in power and like deliver you, and then you're going to be able to do it. And it's going to happen just like that. We're just going to wait on God, and God's going to do something, and then we're done. Like we did it, like it happened, right? And then if it doesn't happen, we're like, oh my gosh, God's not even here. Maybe there isn't even God, right? That's really not how it works, okay? In salvation, God gives immediate help and hope. You go to the next slide. Which is, he gives us the grace of repentance, which is incredibly freeing and peace-giving. He gives us the truth, something to operate on, a vision of purpose and clarity. He gives us union with him. He's like, look, when you believe in me, I'm going to come and live in with you. You'll never be alone again, not once in your life, okay? A reconciliation, we know that we're separated with God. We have the potential to be separated with others, right? We're justified before God. If God's for us, who can be against us? Who can bring an accusation against one whom God has justified? We stand in union with Christ. You don't have to be miserably ashamed of yourself, even if like you would go back and change most of the things about your previous life. And in the spiritual empowerment of the presence of the Holy Spirit himself. That's all immediate. But most of what happens to us in the process of sanctity, or the sanctification process, growth in godliness, is a developmental pathway. Jesus is calling us in the truth to his way, and through that way, to grow into his life, right? And those things are things like healing those things. Now, this is why this is confusing for people very quickly, is because the miracles in the New Testament happen immediately. But they are signs mostly towards things that happen in Christian spirituality developmentally. That's a big confusion. People want to believe that if the same power of the Holy Spirit that is in us was in Jesus, and if Jesus did these things miraculously in an immediate way, then if we're similarly spiritual to Jesus, they would happen immediately for us. But what we're missing is a function and a sign, and the difference between those two. Jesus was doing a miracle that was a sign of something that would be developmental in us, because he couldn't do a miracle that was process, as an event that people could see. We have to listen to his teaching and realize that he's saying, okay, for most of us, what it looks like to gain our sight, to be able to hear the voice of God and listen, to not bring a collateral verse on others, that's all going to be developed. It's going to take time. And once we all believe that, then we can all put up with each other as everybody is going through that process in reasonable good faith. Does that make sense? So is there one more slide there? Yeah. And so over time, through walking in the Spirit, one of the places of the spirituality of this is John 13 through 17. Jesus goes through the spirituality after he would leave. And it looks like this. We go from delusion to him teaching us the wisdom for serving, from denial to wisdom, from inability to agency, from collaterality to care in serving other people, from the domination to liberty, from death to resurrection. These things come through into our life. We're processing, well, resurrection happens immediately. Yes, sort of. But we are raised in baptism, and then we learn in Philippians 3 to die with Christ in his crucifixion, somehow attain the resurrection from the dead, and experience his resurrection power, Philippians 1, in the present, until we physically die and are raised from the dead. And actually experience the loss of our fear of death. That's a process. Until where it really comes home as an emotional reality for us. Does that make sense? You can believe it in a moment, but to react because remember, what's addiction? Is addiction cogitative? I'm gonna think this through. I'm gonna take some heroin right now, or is it reactive, out of an emotional and sensual place? Right. What has to happen is what we believe morally and spiritually has to work its way down the human person to its most basic functions of emotional reaction and ultimately even our sensuality, so that the things that we sensually enjoy are good, and things that we have even sensual aversions to are bad. Right? This is one of the reasons why anti-Christian, I don't want to label this politically or anything, but an anti-Christian pushes, one of the things they'll do is to make it so the reaction of disgust means that you are stupid and evil. But actually disgust is having your morality functioning on the sensual level, which is actually necessary for healthy human existence. There are things that really should disgust you, and you should have responses of disgust to them. And you can go to somebody who's a super secular atheistic person who's like, oh, all those Christians, they're all disgusted by gay people and stuff. But if you say something that they don't like politically, what's their response? It's an immediately emotional and sensual response of direct and personal disgust, right? And the thing is, that's not necessarily bad. It means that their ideology is formed into their emotive nature, which is formed into their sensual response. It's actually, you want that to be connected. You just want to be connected around the truth, and I just think they're wrong. Does that make sense? And so in the Bible, right, it says you're supposed to know what's clean and unclean. You're supposed to have disgust at the right things. They say, this disgusting thing is an abomination. You should have a response of disgust to that, right? And incidentally, one of the things the Old Testament says we're supposed to have a response of disgust toward is sexual immorality of all kinds, right? So this is a process. What that means is that not only can we walk in a process with our own addictions, small a, but we can walk with addicted people, even in chronic addiction, as they walk in this way, as Jesus is bringing them through those 7 miraculous transformations, but over time in a developmental way. Okay, very, very quickly, I'm just going to just read these. Oh, sorry. Yeah, can I spend 1 minute on this? Okay, so think about it this way, okay? Right now, you might say there's like 5-ish, maybe there's 25 different theories of addiction. Why does addiction happen, right? One is the disease theory. The other is things come from trauma and hurt. Another is isolation. Another is lack of purpose. Another is developmental lack of resilience. You can probably come up with it more. These are the 5 that seem to keep coming up as I read stuff, okay? All of these have incredible millennia-old resources from Jesus, right? Like, when it comes to disease, like, the doctrine of depravity or sin and how it functions in us creates a healthy, spiritualized self-suspicion morally within us for us to keep the door slammed on areas of sin that we're most prone to, and recognizing the presence of the Holy Spirit gives us power even in areas of disease, so we can have responsibility and agency while respecting the diseased nature of certain parts of our being at this moment. So that we can embrace a disease mentality with proper limiting principles spiritually and have a positive relationship towards it. The same thing is true of trauma and hurt. Like, Jesus gives all kinds of resources for healing and emotional healing that he's calling us to, and a healing community. Isolation, he creates a fellowship of people. That's literally what he does, so that we don't have to be isolated. The Bible says that he puts the widow and the orphan in families, right? And then under lack of purpose, God tells you who you are. He says you're made in his image. He calls you a certain kind of moral life, a certain kind of purposeful life. He calls you to take dominion in the earth and to make more human beings and to be a marker of the ministry of reconciliation with each other. Like, the problem in Christianity is not that we have too little meaning and purpose. Okay? The problem in Christianity is we are too infirmed to bear and carry all of the purpose that God has given us. Which means we don't have to be addicted for lack of purpose. And lastly, lack of resilience. So, there's a gentleman named Stan Peele, I think his name is, and he's like basically like, look, the way we need to deal with addiction is to just focus on people developing. People just are adulting. They just they don't have the skills. Like, and they don't have like the moral character and the moral foundation, and they don't face enough problems, and they don't test themselves enough. And so this like coddled helicopter parent generation that doesn't know how to adult, of course they're going to be like thrown around by all their whims and play 47 hours of video games and like get addicted to all kinds of crap. Because they don't have any capacity. We need to build people's capacity, but here's the thing. We're all on the way with Jesus. He's taking us in a discipleship process. He's building us up into persevering people who are up for martyrdom. And if Jesus can build into you so that you're ready to die and you're going to make it to any end, he's building you into the kind of person with this kind of resilience and capacity for self-reliance that can face our addictions. Does that make sense? And when you put that all Okay. And when you put that all together, right? Because remember, helping people overcome infirmity is not about just one answer. It's about as many answers as you can give them, all working together. It's like, when you're layering the mountains, like I wear 5 layers. No one of them would have been enough. I want all of them. So like, all these different metaphors, all these different ways of thinking about it, we want to add them all together. Because everybody's living in a cocktail of hurt versus capacity. Everybody's living here. And when hurt, out goes your capacity, you collapse. Right? And sometimes it's you gotta bring down the negatives, and sometimes it's you gotta get up the positives. You just gotta get into the positive, and you can function, right? This is what counselors do. They get people from here to here. Like that's their whole job. And they're needed, right? But the job of discipleship of Jesus is to get people here, is to widen this gap out, so that when they're not in the crisis of it, like, Counselors, look, they're busy people. They've only got time for people in crisis. They got waiting lists a mile long. Our job is to receive those people back, like to help people to get through till they can see one, and then receive them back and get them from +6 to when they got discharged to +65. Through the process of deep discipleship, community, meaning, purpose, and hanging with people in their development. Does that make sense? Okay. 6 things very quickly. No, sorry, 4. 1, natural revelation and special revelation are complementary. Hence, psychology and theology should be able to go together. So we need to do the work to figure out how they do, okay? And not be mean to psychologists or mean to theologians. We need to be open and like trying to learn as much as we can. Second is, 2 is, you don't, as a Christian, you should have no sense of inferiority in the face of medicalized psychology. Whether you're a Christian counselor, or whether you're just a Christian advocate or a disciple maker or a pastor. Look, the psychological resources of Jesus, even in areas as technical as addiction, if we actually understood them and didn't have utterly simplistic, superstitious views of Christian faith, are way beyond what's been developed by psychology. Every time I read something that's like getting closer to what makes some kind of sense of helping people in psychology, I'm like, oh yeah, that's in John chapter 6. Right? I don't know, but that's always the feeling I'm having. This next thing. Oh, sorry, I don't have time for that. The third is, Christian faith is only potent and helpful for addicts when it's Christian. Okay? One of the things that people like Dani and Kevin are always dealing with is new clients who have to tell them about how badly they've been treated at church, the crazy theology that they were taught, the incredibly unbiblical spiritualities that they faced, the abuse of people in the church that the church has tolerated and didn't do church discipline on, and so on. And when secular counselors get those people, what they often tell them is, you need to get as far away from the church as you could possibly be. Now that's actually malpractice, but a lot of people do that because I know because I've heard it lots of times. But even people like Dani and Kevin are still like, look, I gotta empathize with people. That stuff happens constantly in our churches. Listen, Christ and the church are great assets to addicted people when we are sanctified, when we are holy, when we are loving, when we are caring, when we are on the way of discipleship ourselves. Only then will we have the kind of ability to love everyone, including people who are addicted, and chronically so. And then the last thing is this, is that expertise, technique, and pharmaceuticals will never be able to replace love. Okay? Counselors cannot save us. Do you understand? They are carpenters, they are not wizards. There's not some psychological wizardry by they can just heal people and they're just done, it's over. Right? Like they build cabinets. They're just like, okay, how depressed are you today? Okay, let's try to get here. Here are some coping mechanisms. Like, they're not these magic people. The people who are supposed to take care of people are us. We are supposed to love each other. Like, G.K. Chesterton once said a very offensive thing about women. He said, there's nothing as cheap as a mother. And what he meant by that is no government will ever be rich enough to pay people to care about each other. Half the debt in this country that we're stealing from the generations not yet born is because we're trying to pay people to care for people. It's unbelievable. And then we can't even have families. Like, we have to you are here literally just to love other people. The entire purpose of your life is to serve others. That's it. That's literally why you're here. Why I'm here. For you. I'm here for you. I'm supposed to be like, whoever, was it Ray Baumeister, psychologist? He wrote, is there anything good about men? And he talks about the exploitation of men. And I know women get upset about this, but essentially what he says is, men are like a coal mine. We let the whole world mine us out. And we provide and protect for people until we're all used up. Like, my kids are finally in the house. I've been carrying 6 people for 20 years. But that's what my life is for. Right? I remember this like single dad talking about he's like, I spend time with my kids, I see my kids every week. It's like, and he was talking to some other guy, and the guy was like, the guy was dad too. He's like, you're supposed to see your kids. Like, quit bragging about seeing your kids. That's ridiculous, right? And see, this idea, we think we're here to eat sweet things, and to flip through stuff on our phone, and to buy stuff that makes us happy, and to be thought important, and to get our 15 minutes of fame. None of that stuff is important. It's all fantasy, right? It's like, I forgot what Kevin said about pornography, that's like a parody of love. Right? We are literally all of us living in a parody of human life, and thus isolating each other, and we're all the weakest and the most at risk of us are all breaking down, and then we go, well, you should go see a counselor. We'll pay for your health insurance. And then you come out and just isolatedly take care of yourself somehow. And friends, that's never going to work. And that's never what we were called to. And so we can be a rehabilitated community, but the only way to do it is to sacrificially, with real presence, in the atoning centering of the cross itself, with not a simplistic view, but a simple invitation, participate in other people's recovery. And in doing so, the Spirit will help us in our own. Okay, let's stop there.
Let's pray together, and we will keep talking about next steps, but let's just end this in prayer. God, thank you so much for each person in this room, and for you see exactly where they are in the process that they are in relating with you, and your relationship with them, and your care for them, and how you've seen the generations before them leading up to this moment right now, how you know about all the relationships, and you see all the connections for them. God, I pray that you would encourage us by your Spirit that to just see what's right in front of us. What's the next thing that you have for us today? What's the one thing you want us to hear? I pray that you would show us either in a conversation or in this moment right now as we reflect on our drive home, as we pray with others, and the resources we reach out to. God, please provide next steps for each of us today, and that we would walk away with one thing. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we've got a little bit of time before our end note too. There's about 15 minutes, so just want to provide some follow-up and next steps for you guys. So I had mentioned before that we want to make it as easy as possible for you to connect, because that's why within Oaks Ministry events, we are not usually hiring, I don't think we've ever done this, that we hire some famous person that no one knows, that's not from the community, because we want it to be about relationship, and we want you to be able to, you can know Kevin, you can know Dani, you can know Nick, you can know me. We're all in community with each other. And so we want to make connections as easy as possible. So that's why we have this as an event, and recordings later, that's totally fine to refer back to, but we want to gather, but we also want to connect you from here. So this is one link that will take you to, there's a sign-up form, and it just provides a little bit of information, and then we will reach out to you and get you connected, whether that's with counselors or groups or just resources, whatever you need. And then I also want to say, if you want to learn more about faith and the Christian gospel and the good news about Jesus that we've talked about today, if you want to learn more about that, there is an Alpha course coming up. What that is a class just to learn about God and the scriptures, and it's like Christianity 101. If you know nothing, that's great. That's fine. That's what it's for. And so we're going to have one combined with a couple of other churches. We're doing a joint one at Yola's Cafe. And so this is the sign up for that. It's also on the High Point Church website, highpointchurch.org/nextsteps, if you later think of it and want to go there, but to sign up. But we would love to have you there too if you have questions about that. All right, I think, let me just double check, see if I have anything else. Oh, yes, on your handouts, on the chairs, there is an event survey. We hope to do more events like this. We want to open up conversations for people and then also provide community and connection and next steps. So if you want to fill that out, we'd love to know how this was for you. And we're human too. We would love to improve in the ways that we can to care for you better and to provide another topic of your interest. So please let us know what you think. We would love that. And thank you so much for coming today. We'll just have some time. You can check out the resources. You can go to the prayer room if you want. You can connect with each other, but the facilitators and I will be around for a while too. So thank you for coming today.